the country.
I don't have time for a further question. I apologise to Patricia Ferguson. The next item of business is a debate on motion number 5087 in the name of Lewis MacDonald on policing in Scotland. Members who wish to speak in the debate should press the request to speak button now. I now call on Lewis MacDonald to speak to move the motion. Mr MacDonald, you've got 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. When the Police and Fire Reform Scotland Bill went through the Parliament earlier this year, Labour and other parties raised a series of concerns, both about the legislation itself and about the ways in which the creation of a single Scottish police force would actually be implemented. Above all, while supporting the principle of the bill and supporting the bill itself, we raised serious concerns that many hundreds of loyal and hard-working members of police staff would lose their jobs in order to balance the books, and that as a result many hundreds of police officers would be taken off the front line to backfill civilian jobs in the new service. The Government's amendment today highlights an increase of 65 staff jobs across Scotland compared with the previous quarter. I fear that police staff will simply despair at such a superficial defence from a government that fails to acknowledge a net loss of over 900 civilian staff jobs over the past 2 years. And Mr McCaskill laughs as if his defence is a significant one. Over 900 jobs lost over the last 2 years, a prediction by ACPOS that a further 3,000 jobs will be at risk over the next 3 years. And he comes to the Chamber today and asks us to regard an increase in 1/4 of 1% of the workforce as a significant difference from the pattern that he has set. But we return to the central issue of staff jobs today, but in a context that I suspect few would have anticipated at the time the Act was passed. The most immediate issue confronting police staff is not what cuts will be made, it is who will make those decisions in the first place. When the Chairman of the Scottish Police Authority and the Chief Constable of the Police Service of Scotland gave evidence to the Justice Committee last week, their failure to agree on who was responsible for what was there for all to see. The First Minister described that last week as creative tension, but from the point of view of those whose jobs are most at risk, it was a lot more serious than that. These were more than differences of personal or professional opinion. They were differences also of legal opinion, so important that both Vic Emery and Stephen House had resorted to taking external advice at public expense on the proper interpretation of the new Forces Founding Statute. That is a quite remarkable situation, which deserves to be brought to the attention of the whole Parliament today. It was, after all, Parliament which passed the Act, including exceptional provision that the Parliament itself should keep the new arrangements under review and provide regular reports. What the Act means, what was intended by it, and how it should be interpreted are matters that concern us all. The Act establishes a single police force by amalgamating 8 existing forces and 2 existing national bodies. But the amalgamation creates not one new national body, it actually creates 2, a new police service and a new police authority. And the issue is which of these bodies should be responsible for what. The Act provides clearly that the forensic service should be delivered by the authority in order to keep a sterile corridor between police officers and forensic evidence. As Stephen House told the Justice Committee last week, he as Chief Constable has also conceded control to the authority over a number of important areas, most notably ICT. He is not so willing to give up day-to-day control of police staff or of police finance, and for good reason. Direction and control of police staff are the responsibility of the Chief Constable. They have to be, if he is to take operational responsibility for policing in Scotland. That is clear in the Act, it is clear in the responses of ministers, it is clear in the Government's amendment today. Yet the Chairman of the Board has formed a different opinion on the basis of his own legal advice. He told the Justice Committee last week the police staff will always be employed by the SPA, but before they become police staff, they are staff. When they get allocated to the Police Service of Scotland, they become police staff, and when that happens, they come under the direction and control of the Chief Constable. Stephen House gave the Justice Committee his own interpretation, again based on his own legal advice. In effect, the Board loans the police staff to the Chief Constable on a day-to-day basis, he said, and they then come under his direction and control. Those are statements which I do believe require to be clarified and that is where the Government has a responsibility to express clearly its own view. Before they become police staff, they are staff. That is a proposition which does not appear to be supported in any way by the Act. People who are currently police staff with other forces are about to become police staff of the single national force. It must surely be a matter of concern that the authority which is to employ them appears to believe there is a point in that process where they are not police staff at all. Equally, the idea that staff are on loan to the police service does not seem to provide a secure basis for the conduct of their day-to-day duties, since staff who are on loan between organisations on a day-to-day basis could presumably be here today and gone tomorrow. The Justice Committee invited Mr Emery and Mr House to share their conflicting legal opinions, and both have done so. The Committee has not yet seen fit to publish those opinions. I hope they will revisit that decision in the interest of transparency, but clearly that is a matter for the Committee itself to decide, of course.
Christine Graham.
This is not breaking news, but the committee has agreed that these would be held in private. There's a letter to that effect to Vic Emery and to the Chief Constable on our website, because I think there was a misunderstanding at the time, for a moment disappointing though it was, that we thought we would be giving it to publish, but we've accepted that this misunderstanding. We're not happy about it, but we've agreed together as a committee to go forward and keep it in private.
Liz MacDonald.
I understand that, and clearly that is a matter for the Committee to determine on the basis of the advice they themselves receive as to what they are free to do with that information. But what we do have on record are the views offered on behalf of the Scottish Government by Christy Smith as Head of Police and Fire Reform to both the authority and the service, which is available on the Justice Committee's pages on the Parliament's website and is indeed available at the back of the chamber today. And that letter does take issue with Mr Emery's central proposition that the authority, rather than the Chief Constable, is responsible for the administration of the police service. It quotes Section 17(2)(b) of the Act, which provides that the administration of the police service is a responsibility of the Chief Constable. It describes the question of who does what as a business decision to be agreed between the authority and the Chief Constable, not a question that is constrained by the Act. If the police authority now accepts that view and seeks to make an agreement on that basis with the Chief Constable, then progress can clearly be made. But if it does not, or agreement cannot be reached on the management and control of staffing and resources, it is the police service itself which will suffer. Likewise, Mr Smith's letter is equally clear that the Chief Constable is not constrained in what he can ask civilian staff as opposed to police officers to do, which was a possible unintended consequence of the Act that caused concern to the Chief Constable himself. The Government's view, according to Mr Smith, is that there is nothing in the Act to prevent police staff acting in support of police functions from operating autonomously or taking decisions in the course of their employment. And again, it is important that that is made clear to the police, to the authority and to the staff themselves. We have held this debate in order to give the Cabinet Secretary an opportunity to put on record his own view on these matters, to endorse, as I expect and hope that he will, the responses of a senior official to the various legal opinions which have been offered on the interpretation of the Act, to tell us whether the differences of opinion have now been resolved or continue to be debated and disputed within the service or within the authority, and if they are not yet resolved, to tell us what he is going to do about it. This is not an abstract debate about legal definitions, nor is it simply a question of the wisdom or otherwise of senior public servants seeking separate legal opinions about the interpretation of a brand new Act of Parliament. It is about the security and certainty of employment of nearly 7,000 police staff. Those civilians who work for the police already face uncertainties enough, with the very real prospect of many job losses over the next 3 years. We are calling today for ministers to address the concerns those public servants have and give them some confidence that the budget cuts the police service face will not simply be delivered at their expense. We want to see no more backfilling of staff jobs by police officers, whether in custody suites, in call and command centres or in administrative duties in police stations. We want to see no contracting out to G4S or anyone else of jobs currently undertaken by civilian staff. Most immediately, staff need to see an end to the jousting for control between the police authority and the police service, and a recognition by the board of the authority that it is there to maintain the service, to keep the policing of Scotland under review and to hold the Chief Constable to account, not to run the police service at its own hand. And we need to hear from the Cabinet Secretary today that these disputes have been resolved or will be resolved before Christmas, so that all concerned can get on with the core policing task of making Scotland and Scotland's communities safe.
I now call on Kenny McCaskill to speak to and move a motion, amendment number 5087.2. Mr McCaskill, you've got 7 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to respond to the Labour Party motion and the opening remarks made by Lewis MacDonald. This debate comes just a day after we announced record police numbers. There are now 17,454 officers working in our communities, an increase of 1,220 on the 2007 figure. They are supported by 6,955 police staff, an increase of 65 over the last quarter. Those officers, by all means,
to accept that the police staff numbers have fallen by over 900 since March 2010, and this increase of 65 is only over the last few months.
Well, I get asked on a regular basis by Labour Party members, sometimes by Ms Mara, sometimes by others, what it is, and these are a snapshot. The snapshot in time at the present moment shows that we have more police officers than ever before. And what it also shows is, despite the predictions of doom and gloom by Ms Mara, actually, police staff have increased, not decreased. I have sat in this chamber, by all means, Mr MacDonald.
I'm very grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for taking the intervention. He talks of predictions. Will he now give us a prediction of whether he anticipates that trend in increasing staff numbers to continue?
Cabinet Secretary, can I just remind you, you've got 7 minutes and no longer.
I move on then, Presiding Officer. We've made our position clear. These officers and staff are together, performing excellently. Crime is at a 37-year low. Career rates are at a 30-year high. And public confidence is high. Indeed, figures published yesterday show an overall halving in the number of firearms offences since 06-07. That's testament to the hard work and dedication of every single person working in policing in Scotland day in, day out. As we all know, public finances are under greater pressure than ever before as a result of Westminster budget cuts. The vital frontline policing we all depend on is under threat, and this government will not let that happen. That's why, after extensive debate and consultation, we embarked on the most radical reform of policing in decades. Reform is the only way to safeguard our hard-won gains against Westminster cuts. And it also presents a unique opportunity to do more, allowing us to make a virtue out of a necessity. Yes, moving from 10 police organisations to one means the service will be more efficient, eventually delivering £106 million of savings every year, and will no longer need support functions duplicated many times over, exactly the same as with chief constables and their deputies. As duplication across the police services of Scotland is reduced, there will be fewer police support staff roles. We don't underestimate this challenge, but the Armageddon scenario set out by Labour is just not happening. Indeed, Presiding Officers, staff numbers are up. I recognise the value and work played by police staff. That will continue in the new single service, and have therefore made my position clear that there should be no compulsory redundancies for police support staff. By all means.
Margaret MacDonald.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary. I realise the shortness of time. Before he moves into the area of staffing, I wonder if could I ask him about the area of policy making. I have here the strategy in supporting operational guidance for policing prostitution and sexual exploitation, which was agreed in September last year. It recommends that there should be a devolved or localised way of managing this. Will this continue under a single police force?
Cabinet Secretary.
Operational matters that Ms MacDonald will no doubt engage with Mr House or one of his deputies, and I've no doubt they'll be happy to engage and to discuss that with her. But in Steve House and Vic Emery, we have excellent leaders. Steve brings strong leadership, unrivalled experience and a reputation for successful delivery. Vic brings extensive expertise from business and wider public sector governance. They are now supported by a strong board and indeed by 4 excellent Deputy Chief Constables, with ACCs expected to be appointed before Christmas. Presiding Officer, on governance, the Act is clear. The Chief Constable has direction and control of the police service, and the SPA is responsible for holding him or her to account for the delivery of policing. The SPA and the Chief Constable are moving towards agreement. Indeed, they are meeting again as we speak. In a letter to me yesterday, which I have now lodged in Spice, reference 54549, the Chair confirmed discussions have been fruitful and progressive. It is for them to determine how best to fulfil their responsibilities. It would not be appropriate for Parliament or the Government to tell them how to do that. There is no simple formula that determines who should do what, but it has never been the case that the Chief Constable wanted to control everything, and nor was it the case that the SPA wanted to control police functions. The dialogue is about how the SPA can fulfil its responsibilities to effectively hold the service to account while giving the Chief Constable a coherent and effective set of responsibilities to deliver policing. There is no remaining contention about what the legislation says about their respective roles, and they have reached agreement on the responsibility for all functions apart from HR and finance, and they have already agreed that the Chief Constable will be responsible for HR and finance delivery, so we are 95% there. The remaining point of discussion is on the reporting lines for the head of HR and finance, and that will be the focus of today's meeting. Presiding Officer, I and my officials, as you would expect, have been taking a close interest in this issue. We've been involved in a number of informal discussions involving the Chief Constable and the Chair. But I repeat again, it is for the Chief Constable and the Chair to determine how best to fulfil their responsibilities.
Cabinet Secretary, you need to wind up.
At the Justice Committee, HMICS Andrew Lang said, "What we're going through at the moment is healthy and necessary. We're getting closer and closer to a well-balanced system. I reject the Labour Party motion. I move our alternative motion, which celebrates the success of policing in Scotland, and would urge Mr MacDonald to have more faith in two men of outstanding calibre who have been appointed correctly to positions that I think they will cherish and deliver in."
I now call on John Lamont to speak to and move amendment number 5087.1. Mr Lamont, you've got no more than 5 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to speak today about policing in Scotland and commend the Scottish Labour Party for using their debating time to focus on this important issue. It comes less than 4 months before the establishment of a single police force. The fact that fundamental governance issues remain unresolved is clearly a cause for concern. It is worth noting that the Scottish Police Authority is also meeting today to discuss governance arrangements and the proposed structures and staffing numbers across the service. Clearly, with a live date of 1st of April 2013, time is tight, and it will be a challenge to ensure the necessary structures are set up before then. Just last week, as we've heard already, the Justice Committee was told that the Chief Constable, Stephen House, and the Chair of the Scottish Police Authority, Vic Emery, disagreed over their relationship with important backroom personnel. I do not share the First Minister's view that this amounts only to creative tension. Whilst governance may not set the pulse racing, it is an important topic. The Chief Constable believes it is essential that he has day-to-day control over certain backroom functions in order to have the direction and control of the police service which the Act confers on him. He told the committee he had received legal advice stating the Act does not allow the police authority to delegate control over support staff. What the First Minister described as creative tension, the man who will run Scotland's police force thinks is a gobsmacking major problem with the legislation. Where this balance of power lies is important, not because the current post holders are incapable of working together, but because we do not know who will be in these posts in the future and what decisions they will have to make. The Scottish Government must do all it can to ensure this dispute is resolved as quickly as possible, but more importantly, it must reflect on the fact that it is the Government's legislation that has fallen short. Disagreement remains over who will have control over finance and HR. Significantly, these are the two departments which will be most involved in staffing decisions going forward. And let us be frank about this, because when it will happen, this single police force will inevitably lead to job losses. I will give way to
Member, not accept that it's been made quite clear that it's not who controls, it's accepted that the line of accountability is to the Chief Constable. The point in dispute is reporting lines, not control.
John Lamont.
Well, I think the Cabinet Secretary has articulated perhaps more clearly than he expected, the difficulties that are going to arise when these job cuts are coming, and we should not be under any illusions that are going to be significant job cuts when a single police force comes forward. These lines of confusion, these lines of control which are undoubtedly confused, are going to create tensions. 8 separate back office departments are going to be merged into one. That is how savings are going to be made and how we will create a more efficient police force. I do not dispute that. It is right that this will be done gradually and that voluntary redundancies will be the starting point. But these points of tension, these points of concern, are going to create problems for the future. I'll give way to Jenny Mara.
Jenny Mara.
Would the member agree with me that the points of contention about HR and finance that the Cabinet Secretary has outlined today were exactly the same points of contention that the Justice Committee heard 2 weeks ago, and it doesn't seem that a lot of progress has been made since then?
I agree entirely with what the member has said. However, there's 2 points that do not make things easy for the single police force. Firstly, we still do not have the full business case outlining what savings will be made. During the passage of the bill, the Scottish Government repeatedly said the single force would save between £130 million a year and £1.7 billion over 15 years. But these figures were based on an outline business case produced in the summer of 2011 and were never intended to inform the debate as to whether the single police force would produce the savings. A full business case should have been published before the Act was passed, but was instead been left to the police authority to determine. Secondly, Scotland's police forces currently have a combined outstanding debt of £104 million. This debt will transfer to the new service in April, meaning on day one the single service will already owe £104 million. Now, it has been suggested that as many as 3,000 civilian posts will be lost in order to balance the police budget. It is right that this is a decision for the single force, but as it represents nearly 50% of the current total, I would question whether it is a sustainable prospect. In the short time that I have available, Presiding Officer, I would just want to point out that we disagree with Lewis MacDonald's point in his motion on the use of the private sector for civilian posts. I am not opposed in principle to the police service using private sector in certain circumstances. If the private sector is able to deliver the same services in a cost-effective manner, this is surely something which we should welcome. Finally, Presiding Officer, it leaves me just the time to move the amendment in my name.
Many thanks. We now move to open debate, and I call on Sandra White to be followed by Graham Pearson. A tight 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I do also welcome today's debate on policing in Scotland, which the Cabinet Secretary has pointed out in both his speech and the Government's motion, comes at a time when the number of police officers in Scotland has reached a record high and crime is at a record low, a record which the general public welcome, and I'm surprised that the Labour Party haven't recognised this. I think it's important to acknowledge these achievements, and I hope that all parties are able to balance their views with recognition of the achievements which have been made. I also think it's equally important to take a moment to recognise the hard work and dedication of all those involved in Scotland's police force and to thank them for the work they do in keeping our communities safe. That said, we cannot rest on these achievements alone, and the Police and Fire Reform Bill was passed with the support of the Labour Party. And although the Conservatives abstained and the Liberals opposed, we were able to ensure that we were able to respond to the challenges facing the police service at a time, and it must be mentioned, at a time when unprecedented cuts to Scotland's block grant, which we acknowledge and must acknowledge, come directly from Westminster. Now, as I've said before, the Labour Party supported the bill and in their manifesto stated that it would, if elected, increase administrative efficiencies and free up resources for the front line by legislating to deliver a single police force for Scotland. Now, I do welcome this support, and it's one of the principal aims of the single police force to avoid duplication and allow the police service to protect frontline staff and frontline policing. Now, I note Lewis MacDonald's contribution to today's debate, and to an extent agree with some of his comments. It is important that there is a clear agreement between the Chief Constable and the Chair of the Scottish Police Authority. Now, as a member of the Justice Committee, I've had the opportunity, as have others, to listen to the contributions of the Chief Constable and the Chair of the Authority. And as is said in evidence, most areas of the new police structure have been agreed upon, and that any other areas which require agreement will be reached. It has been said. This, I believe, is a... Lewis MacDonald.
Lewis MacDonald.
Sandra White, and I acknowledge that many areas appear to have been resolved, but will Sandra White confirm that she herself said in committee that she did not accept the argument that there was no dispute here and there was a dispute that had to be resolved.
Sandra White.
Thank you. It may be the language used by some, such as dispute, and I think we did need clarification, but I believe that the Cabinet Secretary has given us clarification that they have agreed, and it won't be long until we have a full agreement on that. Now, I think if we think back, it's a pragmatic approach to the establishment of a single police force, and I think, if you look, it's one that should be and could be expected. Now, I have no doubt that both the Chief Constable and the Chair have the best interests of the police force in their minds and will work to achieve what's best for it. And I think it's something we should support them on, all of us in this chamber at this particular time. Now, at the time of the legislation being passed, members of other parties raised the issue of political interference in the police force, wanting assurances that this would not happen, and it's something I agreed with 100%. And it's something I still fully agree with, and it's one reason why I am a little confused by Lewis MacDonald's motion, in that it clearly calls for a significant degree of political interference in the police force, something which they did not want at the time of the passing of the bill. Now, confusing or possibly a little disappointing, Mr MacDonald, if it does seek political capital out of a situation which I think we all really do want to see resolved. On the issue of backfilling, I think it's worth noting the view of the Chief Constable when he states, and it's minuted, there is no plan or strategy for reform that I am in charge of that is predicated on backfilling. That is in the minutes of the Justice Committee. Now, in conclusion, I do welcome both the assurances from the Chief Constable that this will not happen under his watch, and I also welcome the fact that both the Chair of the Board and the Chief Constable have stated that they are focused on delivering the best police force possible for the people of Scotland. I think it's something we should support them on. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. Now call on Graham Pearson to be followed by Christine Graham. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary will remember I first came to see him in December last year at the invitation of John Finney and encouragement of Christine Graham. I wanted to speak to him about two pressing issues. The first, the governance arrangements for the Scottish Police Service and an absolute need for clarity in terms of operational independence. The second was the absence of democratic oversight on the part of Parliament at this key time of police reform. This morning, the Police Superintendents Association contacted me to reinforce their concerns about operational independence. The incoming Chief Constable is already on record on this matter, and there is a difference of view in terms of his convener. Equally, Her Majesty's Inspector has already commented. In July 2012, the police reform team prepared a blueprint, agreed with civil servants, showing directors of finance and HR reporting via the Chief Constable, alongside heads of public information and corporate services, to the board, all answerable to the Chief Constable. It soon became evident, however, that the incoming, in the absence of any statement from the Cabinet Secretary, the incoming convener for SPA had different views. His first attendance on 23rd of October, Justice Committee, Mr Emery was less than candid about his approach to questions of governance and structure. Yet days later, at his induction meeting for SPA on 29 October, he was able to say, "We have a wide-ranging set of responsibilities in the running of policing. I am a businessman and I see policing through that lens. I equate the Chief Constable to a Chief Operations Officer." He also said the vision does not have a final form and it is for the SPSA that will develop that clarity. As a result of various approaches from ASPs, who included support from Police Federation and approaches from across the police service itself, I raised a motion on the 5th of November entitled Threat to Operational Independence of a Single Police Force. The questions of both the Cabinet Secretary and the First Minister produced a lack of clarity in relation to future operational independence. Much has been made of a creative friction, almost in a light-hearted way, but policing provides the bedrock upon which many communities build. Arrangements in regard to the tone, the direction, and yes, the vision for policing has an impact on that bedrock. Of course.
I thank the member. Can he inform me what the clear notion of this new legislation is as regards who fires and who hires, because we've had mad and bad in that position before.
Graham Pearson.
The point the member makes is a good one, and one that I'll come to at the end of my speech. On 27 November, Justice Committee brought back the Chief Constable and Convener along with the HMI in order to resolve possible conflicts. The way forward was further confused at that meeting. The Chief Constable commented, if debate about primacy and operational independence continues a lot longer, it might start to become negative. He added later, I believe it's essential that I have day-to-day control of HR and financial functions. We learned far more that day about what was happening from the words not uttered, rather than the few that were. Reporting lines
You should be drawing to a close, please.
Reporting lines to the authority should be through the Chief Constable. The question for the Cabinet Secretary is, does he agree with Christy Smith's letter? Does he equate the Chief Constable to an operational manager? Is the Convener or the Chief Constable responsible for policing? Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Presiding Officer.
I now call on Christine Graham to be followed by Alison McInnes. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'll deal briefly with three issues. One is the job losses or backfilling. The other is the relationship between, if I may say, Emery and House. It could be a good double act in time. And thirdly, the issue of parliamentary scrutiny. On backfilling, I will quote from Chief Constable Smith, who said, I do not think that anyone in the service or from any of the staff associations or professional bodies would advocate backfilling. Chief Constable House said, there is no plan or strategy for reform that I am in charge of that is predicated on backfilling. So let's deal with that. And of course, in relation to non-operational matters, the Cabinet Secretary has given an undertaking to Unison that there will be nothing other than voluntary redundancy, no compulsory redundancies. Now, the fact of a single... I don't have time, I'm so sorry, you've picked a short debate. The fact is that a single police force in Scotland is envied in England and Wales. You'd listen to Radio 4 occasionally. And instead of cuts to the front line, we are cutting our cloth through removing duplication of chiefs, not Indians, if you'll forgive my metaphor. Indeed, Labour have stated themselves they have made 12% cuts in England and Wales. And as for the Tory Liberal coalition, there's a possibility of 16,000 police in England and Wales likely to lose their jobs. Compare that in Scotland with a 7.5% increase. When we move on to deal with the so-called jostling between the SPA's chief and the Chief Constable, I'm confident these will be resolved. Indeed, they indicated to the committee that by December the 5th, I think that may be today, I'm not sure, that should be well on its way. And we hope to have that meeting of minds. And perhaps it has done no harm for them to spend so much time together. In fact, I quote from what they had to say to the committee. We are also focused on working together. In fact, we've spent a lot of time together. Between October and Christmas, we will have achieved the appointment of all the Deputy and Assistant Chief Constables and have agreed a voluntary redundancy scheme. So two men, obviously very powerful men, have got to know each other. I'm sure the relationship will work in time. And a lot is to do with personalities. I'm not going to the wedding, but I think it might get close. As for scrutiny, myself and Alison McInnes and Graham Pearson have put together something. We don't do it on behalf of the Justice Committee. We've done it as backbenchers because we were concerned about SPA and the single police force. And we've put forward to the presiding officer, we put it first of all to the Business Bureau, the idea of a scrutiny panel comprised of backbenchers, cross-party, not with a built-in government majority, but the chair of the Justice Committee chairing in an independent capacity, to look at the arrangements for implementation and management of Police Service of Scotland and the relationships and structures in place to deliver the responsibilities and functions attached to the SPA, the Chief Constable and the Justice Directorate, and indeed the operation of arrangements around policing in Scotland. It's quite a detailed plan we've put to have quarterly meetings, to hold it to account and to report to what we consider, Graham Pearson and Alison McInnes would agree, are the committees that would be involved, like local government and finance. So people on that committee would be there in a representative capacity. Now, when you compare that with what's happening in England, where they had a police commission election with a 15% turnout, a cost of £75 million, They're going in completely the wrong direction. In Scotland, by having the single police force, by bringing in parliamentary scrutiny, we are cutting our cloth, not cutting the service.
Thank you very much. And we now move on to Alison McInnes, to be followed by Colin Keir. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I thank the Labour Party for bringing this debate this afternoon. The police reforms are at a crucial stage, and it's right that we seek to clarify a few basic issues. Minor details, such as who is in charge of what. Now, the whole Chamber knows that the Liberal Democrats oppose the creation of a single force, and there's been some creative tension between the Government and ourselves on this issue. However, now we're past the point of no return. We want to do what we can to ensure that the new police service functions smoothly. The new force begins operation in 4 months, and before it does, there's much that needs to happen. First of which clearly is to ensure that there exists clarity as to what exactly the police authority is responsible for and what the police service is responsible for. And on that, things have not got off to a good start. As a member of the Justice Committee, I witnessed first-hand the evidence of Vic Emery, the chair of the SPA, and the Chief Constable House. They were at loggerheads with each other last week. It was one of the more open and frank evidence sessions, and it did provide an insight into the difficulties being faced in establishing the SPA and the Police Service of Scotland as working entities. And it also highlighted the differing interpretations of how the relationship between the two should work. Early days are meant for discussion, but it seems that the rush legislation has left some rather large kinks to be ironed out. As others have mentioned, the Government were good enough to share the detail of their position on a number of key areas in the dispute, and this was welcome, and I can say that Liberal Democrats largely agree with their interpretation of the Act, particularly where it places responsibility for the day-to-day running of the new service. I hope, however, that the confusion might serve as a warning for the Government to take a little more time over future legislation. At this point, it is vital that a resolution is reached. Now, in opposition to the single force, we often focused on the danger of political interference. But given the circumstances, I think it is right that the Government does what it can to help facilitate a resolution to the confusion that their new law has caused. And if the best way forward is by setting a deadline and making the position clear, then in this instance, that is important. But I do find it interesting that while the Government look to keep the disagreement between the SPA and the SPS chief at arm's length, they are only too happy in other instances to wade in chest deep to matters such as prescribing how the new Chief Constable would spend his budget. Now, let me say, I welcome the fact that there are more police officers in Scotland than ever before, but I cannot agree that an arbitrary number of officers determined by the SNP manifesto team is some holy grail of policing in Scotland. A fundamental tenet of operational independence for the police is the ability for the Chief Constable to decide for him or herself how the resources are best deployed to create a balanced workforce. Having 1,000 extra police officers benefits no one unless those officers are free to get on with the roles they have been trained to do. The number of civilian staff has already fallen dramatically in recent years, and it's not for me or any of us in the Chamber to quantify precisely how many civilian staff our police need to employ. But the fact is that we have already lost over 900 police staff in the last 2 years, and we know that the brunt of the next round of cuts in the new service will disproportionately fall to police staff. Kenny McCaskill's praise for the contribution will ring hollow indeed. The many hundreds of police staff whose jobs are at risk will not find any comfort in the Government's smug amendment today. If the Scottish Government is serious about refraining from political interference with the police, and they should be, and of ensuring that operational independence is protected, then they should show it. They should make sure that the SPA and the Police Service have clarity over the intent and extent of the Reform Act, and then they should leave them to get on with their job, allowing them to shape a modern police service that maximises the value of both staff and officers and removes the artificial distinctions that the SNP have nurtured.
Thank you very much. Now Colin Keir, to be followed by Mary Fee.
Thank you. Having read the Labour Party motion, I have just a hint of a feeling that it's a wee bit premature. When I asked the new Chief Constable and the Chair of the SPA at the Justice Committee how far have you got with resolving the two areas that are still under debate, and indeed when can we expect a resolution in that respect, Vic Emery replied, "We have said publicly that all the structures will be in place before the end of the year." The new Chief Constable agreed with this assessment. I firmly believe we should wait and allow the discussions to continue to the timescale provided by Mr House and Mr Avery. After all, as has been pointed out, their actions will show how effectively the two have developed their own working relationship, if nothing else. Given how determined the two appeared to be in resolving any problems, I do feel it's not necessary for the Scottish Government to step in. As far as the First Minister's use of the term creative tensions is concerned, I believe it's just a storm in a teacup caused by a slightly mischievous opposition in this chamber. The future of policing is a positive one, this despite the cuts, as the Cabinet Secretary has pointed out, handed down from Westminster. We have a new Chief Constable who has believed in the creation of a single force since before the Scottish Government brought in the legislation. And going by his evidence to the Justice Committee, he is still strongly holding to that view and is determined to make it work. The new single police force will inherit record numbers of police officers, the lowest recorded crime in 37 years, and obviously the clear-ups at the highest level in 30 years, while violent crime is at a 30-year low. Scotland's communities are safer with this SNP government, that's proven, and I fully expect the drive from this new Chief Constable to maintain the quality of service provided under the present management regimes. In my own constituency of Edinburgh Western, we have proof that communities are getting safer. Of the council wards which sit in my constituency, for the year ending September of this year alone, there's been a reduction of 16% in crime rates. This, of course, adding to the longer-term success as mentioned a few moments ago. Having spoken to senior police officers in the area, all are positive regarding the upcoming changes. The flexibility within the less prescriptive approach in terms of how local authorities, police and communities engage with each other in identifying local priorities has, I believe, been a success. Certainly this has been the case within my own constituency. The consultation relating to the community policing plans are ongoing, and there is in fact a meeting this evening in the Drumbury Hub with council officials, public and police to discuss the future. Obviously, changes are not easy in any large organisation. However, I am heartened by the Chief Constable House's evidence at the Justice Committee in relation to backroom staff and backfilling of posts, considering the savings that have had to be made, and others have gone into this previously. It's difficult not to compare what's happening in Scotland to what's happening in the south of the border. It's quite clear that the coalition in Westminster has lost the faith of the police service. I suspect at some point the Prime Minister will have to order a review of their current policies on policing. Otherwise, it's fair to say there may be an almighty crash in the system. A prime example of how the coalition has misread any public feeling has to be with the recent election of police commissioners in England and Wales, as Christine Graham has pointed out. Commissioners' salaries ranging from £65,000 to £100,000. I'm coming right to the end. I'm sorry.
Last 15 seconds.
The cost of £75 million is nothing short of a scandal, a waste of money, and I, for one,
closing now.
And I, for one, will keep supporting the Scottish model of policing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Mary Fee, followed by Chick Brodie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm glad we're having the chance to debate policing in Scotland today in order to raise critical issues and concerns that we have about the new single police force. And given that I didn't have the opportunity to speak in any stages of the Policing Reform Bill, I'm glad to be able to air my concerns today, particularly in light of the recent stories about who will have overall control of the single force. The Association of Scottish Police Superintendents is right to call for an outbreak of common sense to clarify who will have control of the key functions of the force, which is only months away. And the Scottish Government must set out a clear deadline to resolve this dispute and not use phrases such as ironed out in good time, as the First Minister said last week. Governance and control. Certainly.
Cabinet Secretary.
Challenging the position of Vic Emery that the only substantive points in dispute between himself and the Chief are the lines of responsibility in terms of HR and finance. He accepts that that is a matter for the Chief. It's how that is a matter is accountable to him. Does she not accept that that is all that remains outstanding?
Mary Fee.
I am not disputing what the Cabinet Secretary has said, but our concerns are such that we have raised a number of concerns throughout this process, and we've been given assurances, and we need clarity around what will happen to take forward this police force, not more confusion and uncertainty. We are talking about the future of policing in Scotland and making sure that we have the best service that meets local needs for people across all our communities should be a priority for the First Minister and his Cabinet. And on the subject of unhelpful language, I'd also like to point out that using the term creative tension to describe the reasonable points made by both the Chair of the Scottish Police Authority and the Chief Constable is inappropriate for such a serious matter and undermines the issue at hand. And, Presiding Officer, looking back at the Unison Scotland brief for the Stage 3 debate on the Police and Fire Reform Bill, it would appear that there were issues about MSPs voting, which we did, on a bill without a final business plan. And while I support the principle of the single police force, the lack of detail on the bill is the problem of the Justice Secretary and his party and must be resolved immediately. No, I'm sorry, I've already given way and I don't have any time, I'm sorry. And must be resolved immediately, not ironed out in good time. The new Chief Constable of Scotland's National Police Force is almost being held in a political straitjacket by the SNP government's promises on police officers. Since 2010, almost 1,000 police civilian staff have been cut, and according to Unison, 53% of these posts are being covered in part or in full by police officers. With a budget shortfall of £70 million for the single police force, the new Chief Constable, Audit Scotland and Unison all agree that up to 3,000 police civilian staff could be cut from the new national service. The front line of the police force does not merely extend to police officers and their deployment on the streets. It also includes essential services such as IT, HR and finance. It betrays a lack of understanding of the nature of policing to describe these elements as support staff. They are highly trained individuals that are vital to police officers carrying out their duties in the community, and it will affect the service and logistics of the new national force if these positions are filled by backroom bobbies. I agree with what Audit Scotland said in its recent report, that at a time of continued financial pressure, there is a risk that backfilling is not an efficient and sustainable use of resources if adopted in the longer term. We need a balanced workforce where the skills of police civilian staff enable police officers to do what the public wants them to do, where they want them to do it. Thank you.
Many thanks. Now call on Chick Brodie, after which we'll move to closing speeches of this debate.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Given the amount of time, I propose not to accept any interventions. I don't wish to be churlish, Presiding Officer, but I'm a bit disappointed that this chamber is being somewhat diminished by a very early opposition motion on this particular matter, a resort to discuss operational issues instead of what I think we should be doing is discussing policy, strategy and a vision. The Labour Party, now I said I wasn't taking any, time is limited. The Labour Party certainly has people of the calibre like Mr MacDonald, like Mr Pearson, to join us in the bigger debates, not have them scramble about in a cursory discourse on operational matters best left to those responsible for the operation. I said I wasn't taking any. An operation set to carry out our strategy, our policy and our targets. On the issue of executive responsibilities in the new police service, the Act outlined the roles and responsibilities for the authority and its Chief Constable. But it's not unusual, certainly in my experience, in the creation of any new organisation, particularly one as important as this, that details of how the operation will work and how responsibilities between the executive function and the authority body will be delineated and how they should be pursued. I believe that will be done so and appropriately over a required but probably minimum period of time. But what we can't have, Presiding Officer, is the opposition calling on one hand to free this service from ministerial control and then, on the other, have the government involved by pressing for a deadline on these operational issues. Resolution is best left to those involved because that resolution in itself, will embed the roles, the processes, the outcomes and the responsibilities that the participants are and will be party to, not least in the manning of the service. Our job here is to set policy, outcomes and a direction for the service and to secure these by review. Our job is not to micromanage the operation, but to set policies for keeping our streets and communities safe. That policy, that strategy, was the one that created the single police force, that drove the need to put an additional 1,000 police officers on the street, that has seen the crime rate at its lowest rate for 37 years, that has noted the clear-up rate is at its highest for 30 years, that offensive weapon handling is down and violent crime is at a 30-year low. And, Presiding Officer, as for the motion calling on the Government to guarantee there will be no backfilling of staff posts by police officers, it indicates the Labour Party's lack of clarity and ability to distinguish between that very operation and the policy set for it. Why would you set a policy on frontline policing to achieve what has already been achieved and then set about jeopardising it? Why would you want to divorce outcomes from a policy that has manifestly made our streets and communities safer? The new Chief Constable has made it clear that, and I quote as Christine did, there is no plan or strategy for reform that he is in charge of that is predicated on backfilling. Scottish policing and policy is in good hands. Now, of course, there will be changes and efficiencies, but there is no reason to believe that the safety of our communities will be compromised, and that's why we should leave this operation to those who know better and who can manage it better than we.
Many thanks. I now call on Margaret Mitchell. 4 minutes, please.
This afternoon's debate has demonstrated the level of concern that exists about issues surrounding next year's implementation of the single police force. The legislation establishing a single police force does not contain the clarity it should, which is perhaps unsurprising, given that the Scottish Government used its majority in both committee and Parliament to steamroll this legislation through Parliament. In doing so, the Government ignored the vast majority of amendments suggested by opposition parties which were tabled to make this a better bill. By failing to listen and by adopting a totally intransigent position, the Act is the worse for it. The disagreement between the Chief Constable, Stephen House, and Vic Emery, the Chair of the Scottish Police Authority, over their respective responsibilities for backroom personnel is evidence of this fact, and it is to be hoped that this disagreement is not indicative of further problems which might emerge. Certainly, the Chief Constable and the Chair of the Police Authority are sensibly working together in negotiations to resolve the matter, but it is deeply worrying that such a major problem with the legislation has emerged at this late date. And can I say to Christine Graham and to Colin Keir that the Government's arrangements could continue to be a significant problem if future appointees do not gel, or if the Chair of the local authority and the Chief Constable decide to take a different stance on support staff. As others have said, the First Minister cannot dismiss this issue as merely creative tension, nor is the Scottish Government's response to all of this, published in today's paper to the effect that there is no problem, any more acceptable. There is a problem, and the Chief Constable agrees, because, clearly, who has ultimate control over the head of backroom departments is an important issue which requires a definitive answer. Another concern is that local accountability may not be maintained, nor, when possible, enhanced, with the establishment of a single police force. During the passage of the Act, Scottish Conservative amendments sought to address this by increasing local authority representation on the Police Authority Board and clarifying what happens when there is disagreement between local commanders and local authorities over policing plans. These amendments were rejected by the Scottish Government, resulting in the Single Police Force Act giving great emphasis to a single national set of structures and solutions. Happily, despite the Scottish Government's steer, the Chief Constable does understand the importance of local policing. Hence, he has announced that the Assistant Chief Constable will be based outside the Central Belt and that 14 divisions will be set up across Scotland, with the Chief Superintendent running each of these divisions. This amendment represents a divisional approach, which is welcome. But significantly, this structure has been devised not as a result of the provisions of the Act, but rather because of a proactive decision by the Chief Constable. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, Less than 4 months from a single police force being a reality, there remains disagreement over who in practice will control HR and finance. The legislation itself does not adequately protect local accountability, and local doubts remain about savings the Scottish Government claims will be made. All of which means, as Graham Pearson confirmed, it's essential and entirely appropriate for the Parliament to closely monitor the implementation of the single police force, bearing in mind that important financial decisions have to be taken in a transparent and open way, and one size does not fit all. The single police force must be sufficiently flexible to establish local solutions for local issues. I congratulate Labour on securing this debate.
Thank you very much. Now calling Kenny McCaskill. 6 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I do note the mutual congratulations there between Labour and Tory, and they continue the Better Together campaign. It's tragic for them that actually it's the statistics, criminal statistics here in Scotland that keep getting better. But let's deal with the debate that we have before us. Is there an issue between the Chief Constable and the Chair of the Scottish Police Authority? Yes, there is. Is it an issue relating to operational independence? Absolutely not. That is not in dispute. It has never been in dispute. That matter, that control, rests with the Chief Executive. That is the Chief Constable, rather. That is accepted by the Chair of the Authority. The position is and remains, as was pointed out at the committee, that they are 95% of the way there. I wish they were 100%, but they are meeting as we are currently debating, and I am hopeful and expectant that matters will have been resolved. What is it that remains? By all means.
Graham Pearson.
Would the member be good enough to acknowledge that perhaps the pressure from Justice Committee in examining these matters might have encouraged these two people to take forward some of their differences?
Cabinet Secretary.
I have no doubt that is a factor, and I've welcomed the involvement of the Justice Committee, as I have in regular meetings with ASPS or the Federation. Equally, I do meet with these two gentlemen on a regular basis, which takes me back. What is the point of discussion that's remaining? It is the reporting lines for the head of HR and finance. It's not operational independence, it's not control, it's not Mr Emery seeking to be in charge of HR or finance, it's simply the reporting lines. Equally, we have to, well, if you give me a few minutes, I'll come back to you. Equally, it has to be said that we're not dealing with two people who are naive or don't have great credibility. Mr House is an experienced officer who's been outstanding Chief Constable of Strathclyde, shortlisted for the Metropolitan Commissioner, and he is, as I say, one of our finest police officers. Vic Emery is a significant businessman who has contributed greatly in business and indeed continues to contribute in public life here in Scotland. Both of them have worked together on the Scottish Police Services Authority. They know each other, they respect each other, and they are working together to resolve matters. Mr MacDonald.
Mr MacDonald.
Grateful to the Cabinet Secretary. He has not made reference yet to the letter from Mr Smith to Mr Emery and Mr House, which is now on the public record and which attempted to resolve some of the differences of interpretation of the Act which had been offered by their legal advisers. Can Mr McCaskill tell us today, do Mr Emery and Mr House accept the views put forward on his behalf by Mr Smith in full, or do they continue to dispute any aspects of that advice?
Mr McCaskill.
This debate, we have had points going back about the necessity for operational independence. We did have the debate on the structures for policing. It was a clear matter raised by Alison McInnes and about others, how it was important that there would not be ministerial interference in policing. And yet, no sooner have we got the Police Act through than Mr MacDonald and others seem to insist upon myself and the government interfering. What we have to go back to is to allow two men of outstanding calibre to narrow the very small aspect that now remains. And I am hopeful that as they are meeting, as we are speaking, matters will be resolved. And I would suggest that Mr MacDonald may care to look at the letter from Mr Emery that is now lodged in Spice. That is the matter there. I believe that this matter will be resolved, and indeed work is continuing to be ongoing. That takes me on to the second aspect, which relates to the position of the police service in Scotland. If we were to listen to Labour, we would believe that nothing was happening in terms of the authority or the police service of Scotland other than the current issues between Mr House and Mr Emery, when in fact work is ongoing. We've got 4 outstanding deputies appointed. Recruitment is going on for Assistant Chief Constables. Whatever may be suggested by Margaret Mitchell, good work is ongoing from the Chief Constable to make sure that we get the right pyramid structure here in Scotland. Policing in Scotland is delivering. Labour seem to dispute the number of police officers we have in Scotland. That is their right and entitlement. After all, south of the border, the position, as was pointed out by Christine Graham, Colin Keir and others, is this. They are going to lose something in the region of 16,000 police officers. The position of the Labour Party south of the border is that that is a scandalous number. Labour think they should only lose 10,000 officers. We do know how Labour are wedded to the Barnett formula. Presumably Labour in Scotland would wish us to lose 1,000 officers. That will not be countenanced by this government. Facts are chills that win it down. Labour keep coming to this chamber. They keep talking the Scottish Police Service down. Sadly for them, the statistics keep showing how outstanding the police service is in Scotland and how it's getting better. We have a record number of police officers, notwithstanding Miss Mara's greatest, dearest wish. In fact, we've even seen an increase in police back office staff over the last quarter. How disappointed she must be. We have a 37-year low in recorded crime, a 30-year low in violent crime. We've seen firearms offences half since we come to office. The Scottish Police Service keeps delivering, and we will keep investing as a government in that police service. I'm in my final minute. The statistics may not, as I say, suit Labour's desire or indeed their desire to create press stories. But the fact of the matters are, the press stories are out there. They're based on the clear facts and evidence. A record number of police officers is delivering a safer, better Scotland, and faith and belief of the people of Scotland, notwithstanding some opposition spokesman, has never been greater. I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you very much. Now call on Jenny Mara. 8 minutes, please, or thereby.
Well, Presiding Officer, the fact that the SNP backbenchers, and I've just heard the Cabinet Secretary, are much more keen to address the botched police commissioner elections in England, something over which this Parliament has no jurisdiction whatsoever, tells the whole story here. They do not want to address the difficult problems raised in our motion today. Because with just under 4 months to go till the start of the new police service, this debate today has highlighted some critical questions of the Government's handling of the transition to Scotland's single police force. The guarantees sought in our motion today are ones that we hoped we would never have to seek at this stage, this late stage in the process. Clarification between the two most important roles of the new police service as to who has responsibility over what. Guarantees that local officers will remain on our streets. Yes.
Kenny McCaskill.
The only matter outstanding remains the lines of accountable responsibility that the SPA chair is seeking. Can she tell me, is that not accepted by her? What other aspect is she suggesting is still in dispute?
Jenny Mara.
Cabinet Secretary, it seems to me from the two speeches I've heard from you today is that the same issues about HR and finance are still the same issues that were under dispute when we heard evidence from the Chief Constable and the Chair last Tuesday morning. And I very much hope that the committee's deliberations and this debate this afternoon will help their discussions this afternoon to reach a conclusion on these. But they are still the same issues of contention that exist today. Because in his opening remarks, the Cabinet Secretary spoke of record numbers of police officers on Scotland's streets. But as my Labour colleagues have pointed out, the reality of what is happening in police forces across Scotland is far from what he would have us believe. Scottish Labour has warned the Government for months that their drive towards efficiency savings has created a culture of backroom bobbies, where backroom staff jobs have been shed only to be done by police officers who should be on our streets. And the Cabinet Secretary looks surprised and is asking me where, but we have been telling him for months that this is happening in police stations, in Tayside, in the control room and up and down this country. But time after time, the Cabinet Secretary and the First Minister Yes.
Would she dispute that the HMI Inspector of Constabulary has investigated these allegations of backfilling, and his position is that the only areas of backfilling are situations, limited number, where we have police officers who are female who are pregnant and cannot be on frontline duties, where we have officers, both male and female, who have been injured and cannot be on frontline duties, and apart from those instances, there is no instance aware to HMIC of backfilling.
Presiding officer, according to Unison, 53% is going on. Custody officers in his own constituency, this is going on, and control rooms in Tayside Police. I would suggest that the Cabinet Secretary goes out to police stations across this country and asks people on the ground if this is happening, because Audit Scotland have just confirmed to us that it is. As far back as May this year, I highlighted to the Cabinet Secretary evidence from Unison that 900 police staff jobs had been lost and were now being done by police officers. In his response, he sought to deny the problem and then told me it was an operational matter. When I raised the same issue again at First Minister's questions in October, the First Minister dismissed the claim as utter nonsense, despite my evidence coming from a leaked document to his Justice Department from Kevin Smith, the head of the Police Reform Group. That evidence makes clear the intention of the new single service to cut police staff jobs in favour of officers doing administrative tasks themselves. And as I said just last week, Audit Scotland published its report stating that each force has cut an average of 12% of civilian posts to balance budget. This report goes on to state, This report goes on to state that at a time of continued financial pressures, there is a risk that this backfilling is not an efficient and sustainable use of resources if adopted in the longer term. Presiding officer, we agree with the Audit Scotland report. It confirms what we've been articulating and hearing for months. The lack of honesty from the SNP surrounding their guarantee to put extra police officers on our street is concerning, unsustainable, and it must stop. Because their fig leaf figure of 65 more backroom staff does little to mask the 907 jobs that have been lost since March 2010, and the further 3,000 that Stephen House has predicted will be lost in the future. I'll take the Cabinet Secretary now.
I was a member of the Justice Committee when the Chief Constable, Stephen House, was there and made it quite clear that he had no intention of backfilling. It would not make any purpose. Is Ms Mara suggesting the Chief Constable is a liar?
Jenny Mara.
The Cabinet Secretary needs to look at the evidence for himself, and I would suggest that he goes out to his constituency, he speaks to the custody officers, he speaks to the trade unions, and he reads the Audit Scotland report, and he might get an accurate reflection of what is going on in the police force in this country. Because hard-working police staff should not have their fate hidden away in leaked documents from reform subgroups or from an Audit Scotland report, only to have these denied by the First Minister and the Cabinet Secretary. And that's why Scottish Labour has asked for a clear guarantee from the Government today that they will reverse their intention to backfill police staff jobs. And we are disappointed that the Cabinet Secretary has chosen to ignore this in his amendment this afternoon. The need for clarity is why we brought this debate to Parliament. And nowhere is clarity more necessary than in the leadership of the single police force. From day one, the public must have confidence that those in charge have an irreproachable mandate. Yet, as Lewis MacDonald said, we have reached an astonishing point where our Chief Constable and Chair of the SPA are already seeking separate legal advice on their own job descriptions. Now, we're all for creative tension between colleagues. It can help establish better relationships and define responsibilities. But when it gets to the stage when you feel you have to seek legal advice on your own job description, it strikes me that there might be a problem with the employer. This is not, Cabinet Secretary, about seeking political interference. The Government must act on behalf of Parliament that agreed this important bill to exercise its ministerial accountability, not ministerial control. If I can turn to a final point, Presiding Officer, the whole Chamber, I think, knows that my colleague Graham Pearson has been pushing for improved scrutiny for the single police service since this bill was first introduced to Parliament. He argued passionately for better scrutiny of both the Chair and the Chief Constable by Parliament, so that issues such as this would be dealt with swiftly by a specialist commission. Now, we are glad that a slightly watered-down version of Graham Pearson's proposal has received cross-party support and hope to see it advanced as quickly as possible. But until it does, it is the responsibility of the Government to facilitate a resolution to this conflict as quickly and efficiently as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. And that concludes the debate on policing in Scotland, and it's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 5088 in the name of Jackie Bailey on Scotland's Health Service. I'd invite members who wish to speak in this debate to press the request to speak buttons now or as soon as possible. And Ms Bailey, if you are ready, I would call on you to speak to and move the motion. Ms Bailey, 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I welcome this opportunity to debate Scotland's health service. We are all rightly proud of the NHS, and we are all grateful to those dedicated staff that work in it to make our experience of the NHS the very best it can possibly be. But let's be clear, they don't just want our thanks, they want and need our support, and above all, they want us to be honest about what is going on in hospitals and health centres across the country. We in this chamber trade figures about staffing numbers and budgets, and I know that there are 2,500 fewer nurses in the NHS, bringing the nursing workforce to a level lower than when the SNP took power. I also know that the health budget will have declined by £189 million in real terms, and the cost pressures on health boards are enormous. A cursory glance at any set of health board papers will tell you the truth of that. But, you know, the SNP simply deny the truth. The level of complacency that they have displayed and, frankly, continue to display in their amendment is, frankly, breathtaking. But they will not be able to deny the reality as health service workers themselves report how they struggle to cope with increasing demands and even less resource. Audit Scotland put the NHS on an amber warning. 9 health boards had underlying deficits. 3 health boards had to borrow money to break even. Health budgets had decreased in real terms from 2009-10, and that was set to continue decreasing over the next 3 years. Savings were deemed to be a significant risk of not being delivered, and there was a £1 billion backlog in repairs, more than half of which had a direct impact on patient care. The SNP's amendment just might as well have come from a parallel universe. Are they really questioning what the Auditor-General had to say? It was a damning report card by anybody's definition, but what we got from the SNP at the time was a blizzard of statistics and assertion from the Cabinet Secretary about how everything was wonderful. And I have to say, Presiding Officer, I feel a degree of sympathy for Alex Neil. Most of this mess is not of his making. He has inherited this from the former Cabinet Secretary, Nicola Sturgeon, but he is now the one left holding Nicola Sturgeon's poison chalice. And let's look at some of the challenges that Alex Neil has inherited. Let me start with waiting times. Others will talk more about NHS Lothian, but what is now becoming clear is that the manipulation of waiting time figures was going on well beyond NHS Lothian. At NHS Tayside, NHS Grampian, and allegations have been made about none other than NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde. Labour members said months ago that the practice was widespread. We even gave examples, but the former Cabinet Secretary was in denial. This was just a local problem. I even recall Mark MacDonald, who's in the chamber, and Joe Fitzpatrick accusing me of innuendo and casting aspersions about NHS Tayside. This would, of course, be the same NHS Tayside that last week suspended 2 members of staff of suspected manipulation of waiting times. I look forward to receiving Mark MacDonald's apology, but I'm not holding my breath. And in NHS Grampian, patients get a letter saying that they want to make an appointment, and then they ask you to call to set it up. But there are time restrictions on when you can call, and the line is constantly engaged. And also in NHS Grampian, a pensioner approached their 12-week time limit to then be offered at short notice treatment at Glasgow or Tayside when there was no space available at either of those 2 locations. His wife kept on the case, and when she threatened publicity, she got a cancellation the next day. She tells me that she reported this matter to the Cabinet Secretary's office. Both her constituency office and to her civil servants, but she was essentially ignored. The question is, did the former Cabinet Secretary know that the problem was widespread? Did she know about this experience in NHS Grampian? And the real scandal, presiding officer, will be if she knew and then did simply nothing. Now, when we last debated waiting lists, we pointed out the warning signs to the then Cabinet Secretary. Social unavailability underwent a dramatic and unexplained rise from 4,967 in 2008 to 20,662 in June 2011, a fivefold increase in a matter of a few years as people had their waiting time suspended so that the figures would look good. That was the SNP's hidden waiting list. In 2010, Audit Scotland produced a report that highlighted concerns about how waiting times were recorded. This is what they said. The report also finds that the NHS is not accurately recording all relevant information on patient waits, which makes it difficult to demonstrate that it is managing patients correctly in line with the new guidance. And then ISD, the government's own statistics division, says that several health boards, and I quote, have been warned about high levels of social unavailability. What did the Cabinet Secretary then do to address these concerns? Did she even monitor what was going on? Did anything, absolutely anything, change as a result of Audit Scotland's report in 2010 and their very clear warning? I suspect not, presiding officer, which is why we are in the mess we are in today. And let's not forget that behind each and every one of those statistics of a waiting time breached is a patient with a need for treatment that might be suffering unnecessarily as health boards fiddle their figures to satisfy the SNP. Waiting time targets are challenging, there's no doubt about that, but you don't deliver them by creating a culture of fear and intimidation so that staff are forced into positions of hiding the truth. In one of the largest health boards in the country, there are staff off sick long-term as a result of stress because of what they have been asked to do to manipulate waiting times. A woman in my own constituency with suspected breast cancer was told that she wouldn't be seen until the new year, breaching her waiting time because clinics were being cancelled for the whole of the holiday period. And what happens when these targets on waiting times are missed? The breach, as we understand it, needs to be reported to the Scottish Government. But is there any monitoring of what then happens to patients who have breached? Are they left to languish, waiting for treatment, as the attention turns to those not yet in breach? Let me explain that to the Cabinet Secretary. In Forth Valley, a patient waited 337 days over the 62-day target to be treated for upper GI cancer. That's over a year. In Grampian, a patient with colorectal cancer waited 133 days over the 62-day target. In Lothian, a patient is waiting for lung cancer treatment for 67 days over and above the 62-day target. It seems that those who have breached just aren't treated quite so urgently. And I hope the Cabinet Secretary can reassure me that this is not the case and that he will investigate and monitor this situation. Reports in the Herald identify hundreds of Scottish patients that are waiting too long for cancer treatment, with more than 1,000 breaches in the last 2.5 years. And let's be clear, this was due to a shortage of staffing and equipment, not because of the complexity of the cancer or the need for more diagnostic tests. The Government's response is that this is within the 5% tolerance level. But I ask you, can we really tolerate delays to cancer treatment of such extraordinary length when we know that early diagnosis and early treatment can save lives? And only yesterday, presiding officer, damning evidence was given at the Health and Sport Committee by Scotland's leading cancer specialists. They described the lack of access to up-to-date cancer treatment and training, and now the difficulty in recruiting to specialist cancer centres. This was because Scotland's NHS is now looked on, and I quote, as quite an inferior health service. Their frustration is their inability to prescribe a course of treatment which they know will prolong life and which is routinely available in England. Their clear view that the individual patient treatment request is inadequate and simply leads to a postcode lottery must be acted on. and I welcome the review announced by the Cabinet Secretary, but we must make sure that any replacement system is fair and not dependent on where you live. Members may also recall similar comments made recently by one of our leading cardiologists in respect of cardiac treatment, and Scotland falling behind in the use of new technology and innovative treatments like TAVI. Presiding Officer, the SNP amendment, I confess, I found a little embarrassing, because you only need to look at NHS Lothian to know that financial targets are indeed at risk. Their board papers, the most recent set, report a projected deficit of 12 million. And of course, the SNP's amendment removes the line in our motion that calls on the Scottish Government to provide guarantees that waiting times manipulation has not spread beyond NHS Lothian. So now, Presiding Officer, we know the truth. It has indeed been wider than NHS Lothian. The NHS in Scotland is in danger of becoming second-rate on the SNP's watch, and I implore them genuinely to stop and listen. Set aside the spin, pay heed to the chorus of voices, not from in this chamber, but from health professionals, from patients who are telling you that all is not well with our NHS. And you know, the more you hide the truth, the more you bury your heads in the sand, the more you come up with delusional amendments, the more people will decide that you can't trust the SNP with the NHS.
Thank you very much. Now call on Alec Neil. Did you move your motion?
I move the motion.
Thank you. Now call on Alec Neil to speak to and move Amendment 5088.1. Mr Neil, 7 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer, and I move the amendment in case I forget to do so. Can I, first of all, welcome the opportunity yet again to put on record my gratitude to the dedication and commitment of the NHS staff throughout Scotland, and indeed many people who work in GP surgeries, dental surgeries and many other parts of primary care who are not actually direct employees of the National Health Service. In the 3 months or so that I've been the Health Secretary, I've undertaken a series of visits, including so far 3 unannounced visits to frontline services, and the dedication and the professionalism of the people I've met is second to none. Can I also say that the National Health Service in Scotland directly employs over 150,000 people. We have a total budget of £11.5 billion nearly every year, and every year something like 6.3 million consultations with hospital doctors alone take place in the National Health Service. Inevitably, when that happens, there are some things that do go wrong from time to time. But let me make it absolutely clear, as I've done in the past, if things go wrong, then we should find out about it, we should be told about it, and I will make it my job, along with Michael Matheson, to sort it. I don't have much time, so I don't have many time for interruptions, unfortunately. Let me make it absolutely clear that where there are individual cases that need investigated, they will be investigated and solutions, or if it's appropriate, an apology delivered. If there are systemic problems, then my view is that we should tackle those systemic problems. There has been a systemic problem in Lothian in terms of the waiting list. We are tackling that. If there's a problem in any other board, and there appears to be one in Tayside, then we will deal with that as well. Now, I want to deal with the particular issues raised in Jackie Bailey's motion. First of all, in relation to finances. It should be made absolutely clear we have kept our manifesto commitment to pass on the Barnett consequentials to the health budget in Scotland. And this ensures that more than £1.1 billion of additional money will be invested over the 2010 UK Comprehensive Spending Review period 11-12 to 14-15 to protect frontline services. Had Labour won the election, that figure would not have been £1.1 billion, it would have been zero, because as Ian Gray made clear on the 8th of September 2010, Labour would not ring-fence the health service budget. Now, in terms of the territorial boards who provide the frontline services, the uplift to territorial boards for 2012-13 was 2.9%, above the rate of inflation of 2.7%, and next year
will provide an increase to the territorial boards of 13.3%, above, again, the rate of inflation of 2.5%. And I don't have time, unfortunately. Can I say to Jackie Baillie and to the Labour benches that if we hadn't had to pay out year upon year £184 million for PFI charges, then much of that money would be available for reinvestment in the National Health Service. And we've also had to cope with the capital cuts announced
Point of order from Neil Finlay.
If you can help, the Minister says that he does not have time to take an intervention. He has 7 minutes, which is more than any backbencher has in any debate, and they are expected to take interventions.
Thank you for the point of order. However, it is not a point of order. It's a matter for the speakers in this Parliament to decide whether or not they choose to take interventions. Cabinet Secretary.
Officer, I have so many errors to correct and so much to say that's actually the truth. The 7 minutes is not nearly enough time. Now, let's deal with Audit Scotland. Within this report of the Auditor General referred to, let me quote what she says. In her report, for the 4th year running, all National Health Service boards met the 2 financial targets of breaking even against their revenue and capital budgets at the end of the financial year. And, quote, the relatively small surpluses achieved by boards at the year end highlights the careful management of the financial position. So let us get things in context, Presiding Officer. The reality is that financial management in the health boards, according to the Auditor General, has been sound. Now let me deal with waiting lists. 90.8% of patients were seen and treated within 18 weeks from the initial referral during September 2012, the period of the latest statistics, against a target of 90%. The target was exceeded. And of course, in dealing with the issue of the alleged fiddling of the figures, we have 14 audits going on. I have made it clear yesterday in the Chamber, every one of those reports will be published by the end of the financial year. And where there is fiddling, we will deal with it. We will take appropriate action. And where the Auditor General in her report recommends any action, we will act on that as well. I've only just over a minute left. So, unlike Labour, we do not have hidden waiting lists. We will not hide behind anyone. If there are problems to be solved, we will tackle them, we will solve them. And let me say also, in terms of waiting times for a first outpatient consultation, the most recent statistics show that 97.1% of patients had waited less than the 12-week standard for a first outpatient consultation. This compares with waits of 6 months in March 2007. The statistics also show that 97.1% of patients had waited less than 12 weeks for inpatient and daycare treatment. This compares with 8 months that we inherited 5 years ago. And in relation to cancer drugs, I have initiated the review being undertaken by Professor Routledge, and I've asked him in a meeting this morning, I've emphasised to him I want him to look at the cancer drugs issue, and when he reports early in 2013, I will take on board his observations, his recommendations on that issue. Any issue like that will be dealt with. Presiding Officer, my time is up and I've got so much more to say, but no doubt I will get a second chance when I wind up for the government in an hour's time.
Thank you very much. And now Colin Jackson-Carlaw, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Well, ever was it thus, I've got to say. This is depressingly like a debate that I'm sure we had within really the very recent memory of us all. And I've got to say that when the Labour Party threw everything at the SNP and when the SNP threw everything back at Labour, were they in reversed positions, they would be doing exactly the same thing. And I know in every fibre of my being that if I was sitting there, they'd both be doing it as far as I was concerned, because this is a debate that is perennial. It is about the future of the NHS. And I've got to say of Jackie Baillie's motion, which I support, that when she talks about financial pressures, that is not an accusation that the government is cutting frontline health spending. It is an accusation that the choices being made by this government today are putting pressures on the NHS. Now, I similarly have a certain sympathy with the Cabinet Secretary. In the previous Parliament, Scottish Conservatives routinely supported the administration in the decisions and the way in which it progressed on issues relating to healthcare. But we did identify concerns that we thought were chickens that would come home to roost, and I believe they now are. We believe that the preventative agenda was being undermined by the dissolution of the health visiting service. We believe that financial pressures would be added to, not by the principle of free prescriptions, but by the progression of that policy at the very moment when financial pressures were at their height. And we said that there was an ageing population crisis that had huge implications for the health service, which as a Parliament collectively we need to address and face up to, because they can only make the situation even more acute in every year that follows from here. Because it is no longer a problem that will be there for the next generation to deal with. It is a problem, the initial stages of which are lapping at the shores of Scotland's health service today. So it's not a criticism of the NHS or the people within it to ask questions of the way in which the service is conducted today. And I have to say, Nicola Sturgeon was let down by NHS Lothian in the way that the figures were manipulated. The government was let down. But the question Parliament asked at that point was what assurances did we have it was not going on anywhere else, and what investigations were we undertaking in that regard? Now, I'm not here to apologise for Jackie Baillie. She and I have had real old, almost fisticuffs on occasion. But here's what Joe Fitzpatrick had to say and the chairman of NHS Tayside had to say when Jackie Baillie raised the issue of the manipulation of waiting times there. The chairman said he had written to Miss Baillie to insist the Health Board's waiting list data is accurate. And Dundee West MSP Joe Fitzpatrick demanded an apology from Miss Baillie and claimed she had besmirched the reputation of the staff. This is yet another blunder from Miss Baillie, who jumped to the wrong conclusions and hasn't apologised and continues to leave her comments online. It is not an apology from Miss Baillie which is due, but an apology to Miss Baillie which is due for the way in which the concerns she raised were simply and easily dismissed. What the Health Secretary is not in office for, as his predecessor sometimes seemed to enjoy, is standing ovations from all concerned. The Health Secretary is there to support the NHS, but to hold those that run it to account and to ensure that they are doing a job on behalf of the people of Scotland. And we are at a point where, if not a full-blown crisis, if we are to avoid such a thing happening, we have to accept that there are huge pressures, some from the ageing population and the incidence of novovirus that is now overwhelming our hospital wards, the reduction in the number of nurses we have, the consequences of delayed discharge in our wards, the integrity of public confidence in the waiting times. Now, the previous Health Secretary's visits to hospitals became most famous for being accompanied in advance by the smell of fresh paint. It is at least, if not that of Alex Neil. He is, I think, a practical man. He's talked about the whistleblowing and introduced the hotline. He's talked about the access to new medicines. He is visiting health wards without the management being present and listening to what they have to say. This is a moment when practical measures are required from him to address the issues which currently face Scotland's health service. I'll be interested to hear what emerges in the rest of the debate, and in my own opportunity to wind up, I will then conclude whether or not the amber warning which Audit Scotland has placed in front of Scotland's NHS is one which this government recognises, acknowledges and is prepared to do something practical, not just blast with rhetoric, to address.
Thank you. We now turn to the open debate. Speeches of 4 minutes, and time is tight this afternoon. I call Aileen MacLeod to be followed by Sarah Boyack.
Presiding Officer, I'd like to begin my contribution to this afternoon's debate by offering my sincere thanks to all the NHS staff who have been responsible for delivering what the NHS Chief Executive described in his recently published annual report as their best ever performance in key areas last year. And by this, he was referring to the fact that waiting times are at their lowest ever levels, patient care is safer, levels of premature mortality have been reduced, and patients continue to rate the care provided by our NHS staff very positively. Now, we are not resting on our laurels, but despite what Labour would have us believe, the NHS delivery of patient care in Scotland is actually overwhelmingly a good news story. I mean, the progress made by the SNP government since 2007 has been striking on all the key measures: reduction in waiting times through the delivery of the 18-week referral to treatment waiting time target, higher numbers of qualified nurses and midwives since the SNP came to office, with Scotland having more qualified nurses and midwives per 1,000 population than anywhere else in these islands, protecting the frontline NHS budget, which will continue to rise in real terms despite the substantial cuts to the Scottish budget imposed from Westminster, realising over £1 billion of efficiency savings between 2008 and 9 and 2011-12 to be reinvested to boost frontline care for patients, and of course the SNP government's commitment to no compulsory redundancies in the Scottish NHS, which is not in place in England, while taking action at the same time to ensure that our hospitals and communities have the right number and mix of nursing staff available. And despite the challenges that NHS faces, this is a good record, and one that testifies to the commitment of this government to ensure that our public has access to the best possible universal health service, and one that is free at the point of need. And certainly the NHS staff have worked tirelessly to deliver these important outcomes. Now, protecting Scotland's National Health Service and its staff against the unprecedented cuts in public spending imposed by the UK coalition government is a central element of the social contract this government has made with the people of Scotland. And it's worth stressing that only the SNP was prepared to commit to protecting NHS funding ahead of the last election, a commitment that it has honoured in government and which allowed Scotland's Auditor-General to conclude that the overall financial performance of the NHS does remain strong. So my concern is not with the commitment of NHS staff to deliver the best possible care for our citizens, or with this government's commitment to protect NHS funding, but my concern is with the policies towards the NHS advocated by other parties in this chamber, and nowhere more so than in the case of universal benefits. We are committed on this side of the chamber to keeping prescriptions free. We are committed to maintaining free eye tests. Both are central aspects of the care that we offer to the citizens of Scotland, and both contribute to the social justice that lies at the core of our approach to government. But more importantly, both also promote the long-term health and welfare of our citizens, and in so doing reduce the future costs to our health service. That is what Campbell Christie asked us to do, and that is what we are doing. Presiding Officer, it has become clear in recent weeks that the SNP government stands alone in giving these undertakings. We know that no area of universal entitlement to public health provision is safe from Labour's Cuts Commission, and we know they also share this in common with the Tories and the Liberals. But let me conclude with a quote from a paper published yesterday by the Jimmy Reid Foundation, a paper written by a team that includes two internationally respected experts in public policy, Professors Mike Danson and Paul Spicker. And in that paper, the authors state those arguing against universalism, and one has to count the Scottish Labour Party among that number, are guilty of a serious lack of analysis of the consequences of their policies. And of the system being championed by Labour and others, they conclude a divisive, economically inefficient system which increases inequality, reduces the quality of social services, stigmatises and damages the well-being of the poor, but benefits large corporations, is being advocated without any coherent evidence-based case being made.
You must conclude.
So in conclusion, I will support the amendment in Alec Neil's name.
Thank you. Call Sarah Boyack to be followed by Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In the first 8 years of this Parliament, Labour allocated huge increases to health, enabling the system to recover from the last round of Tory cuts, improve patient experience, the quality of range of services provided, and crucially the terms and conditions of NHS staff. And Alec Neil's got a cheek to criticise Labour, given that his predecessor refused to accept NHS Lothian's plea that Edinburgh's sick kids could be built by conventional spending. It will be years late and it will be funded by NPD. And last month, the Cabinet Secretary criticised NHS Lothian as being in the second division, and Audit Scotland revealed that our NHS was in an amber warning. And today, the SNP's motion deletes that warning from the Labour motion. In fact, it deletes the problems correctly identified by Jackie Bailey, but you cannot Tipp-Ex out these problems. Our challenge is to air them in this chamber and come up with solutions. And staff reductions have put massive pressure on the remaining staff, and they've undermined the quality of care that patients received. The fact that interns are now being used to supplement hard-pressed nurses is simply not acceptable. And the waiting times problem in Lothian has blown open the reality in our NHS today. The systematic fiddling of the figures that we've discussed before, the subversion of patient rights, and the fact that the waiting lists were a complete fiction still needs to be addressed. So how on earth can the SNP government assert that all NHS boards have met their financial targets on revenue and capital? What does that mean? It's completely fictitious. In NHS Lothian alone, the estimate earlier this year was that it would cost around £20 million just to address the backlog to deal with the hundreds of people who had not had their waiting times honoured. And yet, last week, the board papers say that that estimate now needs to be over £26 million. And these figures demonstrate that the capacity to meet the government's targets on waiting times is simply not there. To use the Minister's comment, there is a systemic problem. And I'd be interested in the Minister's comments about the level at which the NHS runs bed capacity in the light of this week's report from the Dr Forster unit in Imperial College. It's stark. When bed occupancy tips the 85% mark, the system goes into overdrive and things start to give. For patients, that means the quality of care may suffer. Now, how does that equate to what's happening in our hospitals in Scotland? It feels very much what's happening in Lothian, where the problems have piled up one after one. Only last month, the board have been forced to reopen the Royal Victoria Hospital, mothballed earlier this year to create the extra capacity to get us all through the winter. There simply aren't the resources able to get older people out of our hospitals and into the care that is more appropriate for them when they need it. That is a current problem in the NHS. And it's not just the bed capacity, it's insufficient staff in key clinical areas. I could have spent my 4 minutes just reading out recent press headlines. But the symbolism in this chamber of the First Minister being dragged into the issue of the children's ward at St John's shows the mess that the SNP have created. And you cannot trust these promises from the SNP on health. The last Health Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, was fully aware of these problems. It's Alec Neil's job to sort them out, and we're all waiting.
Thank you. Mark MacDonald, to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. You know, we talk about choices a lot in this chamber during debate, and we've heard talk from Labour members, indeed the Labour leader recently, about the need for tough choices to be taken. And yet, when push comes to shove, all too often what we find is that the Labour Party is found wanting in this area, because they come to this chamber and they criticise the choices the government makes, yet never offer us any alternative choices which we could make instead. They never tell us how they would redirect funding into areas within the health service. They never tell us where funding would come from in order to pay for their priorities. I'll happily hear it in the summing up. I've only got 4 minutes. And what we need to know is we need to know what exactly are the Labour Party's priorities, because I do believe that, generally speaking, there is a consensus around the approach that is being taken in terms of the use of funding to fund frontline health services through the targeting of the increases to the territorial health boards. I do believe that there is generally consensus around that. But what we need to hear from Labour is that if the Labour Party, I would ask Ms Bailey maybe leave it for the summing up or for whoever is summing up for Labour. As I said, I only have 4 minutes. What we need to hear from the Labour Party is about priorities, what their priorities are. Well, the government has set out its priorities as part of the budget process, and if the Labour Party disagrees with that, it's perfectly open to them to suggest alternatives. But we never hear alternatives. All we hear are complaints. And the issue around universality, as raised by my colleague Aileen McLeod, is an important one, whether that's in terms of free prescriptions, whether that's in terms of free dental checks, or in terms of free eye checks. Indeed, Optometry Scotland recently produced a briefing, and I was glad to be invited along to a dinner to discuss these matters further, which I know Ms Bailey and indeed Duncan McNeill also attended, where they spoke about the savings that accrue as a result of free eye checks. They spoke of £60 million of direct savings in terms of direct savings from that, but £440 million of indirect savings that result from the free eye check. So if we look at that going forward, that's a key part of the preventative spend agenda, and those universal services, which I think were what Jackson Carlo was perhaps alluding to when he spoke about chickens coming home to roost, they're actually an extremely important and a key part of the agenda going forward in terms of preventative spend. We also see efforts being made by this government to much closer interlink the health and social care agenda going forward, and I welcome that. I think it will be of great benefit, particularly as we look to try and shift to a healthcare model and a social care model which sees people being treated much more in their own home as opposed to having to be admitted to hospital. The one thing which gives me a little bit of concern, and I hope perhaps I might be able to discuss this further with the Cabinet Secretary, is the recent move by Aberdeen City Council to move their social care department to an arm's-length trading company. And there are concerns from NHS Grampian that that may create some difficulties in terms of the health and social care agenda going forward. I'm happy to speak further to the Cabinet Secretary about that. But I want to focus, finally, Presiding Officer, on NHS dentistry. When this government came to power, there were thousands of people in Grampian on waiting lists for NHS dentistry. Yet now, in a parliamentary answer given by the Public Health Minister, or perhaps it was I beg your pardon, I think it may have been a letter to one of my colleagues, he has made it clear that by March 2013 there will be virtually nobody on a waiting list in the NHS Grampian area. That is a strong testimony to the efforts made by this government to invest in NHS dentistry and NHS dental clinics. But did we hear anything from the Labour Party welcoming that move? Did we hear anything from the Labour Party welcoming the fact that that is going to happen? Not a peep. Because as we know, Presiding Officer, the Labour Party are only happy when they're unhappy.
Thank you very much. Before I call Stuart McMillan, can I ask for some order in the chamber? I can hear conversations better than I can hear members. Stuart McMillan to be followed by Duncan McNeill.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, we are fortunate to have a body such as the NHS. Every one of us in the Chamber will have called on NHS at some point, and we know that without it, Scotland would be a lot poorer. No matter how many times we thank the NHS staff for their first-class work, it will never be enough, but it's important that we actually do thank them and remind them of how important they are to Scottish society. Now, the motion in front of us and the debate so far it has been kind of quite typical. I think Jackson Carlaw's comments earlier, I would suggest, were quite apt. Now, I'm sure that we'll actually agree that the NHS is not perfect. And in fact, I dare say it, actually no organisation in the world is perfect, whether it's a public or a private organisation. Improvements can always be made, efficiencies can always be made, and support can always be improved. But what we have heard today sounds like no more it sounds a bit more like just kind of the scaremongering that's actually been going on for some time now. Nobody should be complacent, as the NHS as a body can always be improved upon. But to downplay its best ever performance, I think is beyond belief, and it talks down the management and the staff of the NHS. Now, Jackie Bailey will know full well that I am more than prepared to campaign for services and challenge NHS management proposals and decisions. In fact, in 2007, we were actually on the same side with that regarding the maternity services. However, I am disappointed, though, that when credit is due, and it's in this instance that it is due, that she can't rise to actually give that credit, but merely focus on talking down what is clearly an overall positive story. Now, I think we've only got 4 minutes today, I'm sorry. And I think also we've heard the waiting times. Ms Bailey, it was your choice for a 4-minute debate. Sorry, through the Chair. It was the choice of the Labour Party for the 4-minute debate. Obviously, with the waiting times being at their lowest ever levels, care is safer than it's ever been, the premature mortality has been further reduced, and patients continue to rate their care very positively. And I actually wonder what it's actually going to take for the Labour Party to actually welcome good news. Over 90% of patients were seen and treated within 18 weeks from the initial GP referral to the start of treatment. And with the Patients' Rights Act, which was passed in 2011, which came into force in September this year, and the resultant introduction of the treatment time guarantee, then I'm actually confident that the NHS will continue to work hard and improve its deliverability even further to the maximum 12 weeks from the diagnosis to treatment. A further example, Presiding Officer, of what I would consider as a success story is that regarding the number of alcohol brief interventions delivered. In 2008-09, there were just over 30,310 to be precise, such interventions. And this has increased steadily to a high of 97,830 in 2011-12. Now, with the debate about alcohol misuse and the effects of such misuse upon individuals and wider society regularly debated, both inside the chamber and also outside, this increase is proof of the determination by this government and the NHS to work hard to help those affected. Alcohol misuse affects all levels of society, and I'm sure that across the chamber we can all welcome the efforts that the NHS have made into trying to help people get their lives back. And I said earlier that there are improvements that can be made, and the Audit Scotland report, which has been touched upon, which the Labour Party motion officer can highlights a few issues. But this is exactly the point, Presiding Officer, that even though the NHS in Scotland has had its best ever performance, there can be no complacency. And knowing the Cabinet Secretary, as we all do, we can be rest assured that there will be none. This Cabinet Secretary will continue the hard work and the focus of his predecessor. And I'm conscious of time, Presiding Officer, but certainly I will certainly be backing the amendment in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, because I know that certainly the NHS in Scotland is safe in the hands of the SNP government. Thank you.
Duncan McNeill, to be followed by Richard Lyle.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. It's our National Health Service. It doesn't belong to any political party, and this is what this debate, although limited in time, is about today. And of course we recognise that the Cabinet Secretary, as he stated today, is that the NHS budget has been protected, certainly better off than some of the other portfolios have suffered greater cuts. But of course, as Jackson Carlow pointed out, that's not the point. Significantly, it doesn't keep pace, as everyone knows, with health service inflation, which is a serious problem with increasing costs. It doesn't, and it's difficult to keep pace with increased demand of staffing costs, and of course, highlighted over the last few days, increased prescription costs. These are all demands that are on our health service. And of course, we're all well aware of the projected 67% increase in the population with a disability over the next 20 years. The numbers of over 85-year-olds will double over that same time period. Heart, stroke and dementia will increase by 40% to 2025. So it's in that context, not in the context of one year to another or one government to another, that we need to ensure that our health service sustains and maintains its reputational value to us all. Warning signs abound. £1 billion maintenance backlog, and I concede half of that may be more serious in the scale, but even half of that is an indication that we are not able to at this time, maintain the fabric of the buildings and hospitals. The amber warning from the Audit Scotland about financial planning, about boards selling off the family silver to get to one year and to another. We understand what happens if that is allowed to continue. The Argyll and Clyde Health Board is no longer here because it tried to sell off land to survive and pay the bills that, of course, got larger and larger. And of course, there is a significant high risk, they also point out, about the efficiencies that need to be made in our health service. The risk of the health boards not meeting those efficiency savings is another warning sign. The warning signs, I think, going back to Jackson Carlow, have been well recognised. I think they're accepted right across the board, and they must be addressed. And there are concerns that we have not, over the period of the last Cabinet Secretary, addressed those as significantly as we should have. We have not heeded Campbell Christie's warning to radically change from the service to the preventive strategies. We haven't made a fast pace of change to integrate health and social care. We still don't have a clear understanding of how the budgets between local government and the health boards work and what they do and what they're expected to do. There are big gaps here. And I think we really, when we talk and give the plaudits to the health service staff, as we have in all of the speeches, when we use them as a shield that you can't criticise because they're there. Well, let's listen to them. The RCN said quite clearly there's a difference between protecting the budget and protecting the quality of services. that we cannot go on as we are, says the BMA. We cannot continue in the same way, says SCVO. Salami slicing of the budget cannot go on forever, says Unison.
Must conclude.
Lack of joined-up thinking in the workplace is not acceptable, says RCNBMA. Take that message away today, listen and act, and save our National Health Service.
Paul Richard Lyle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I first refer members to my register of interests? I actually receive a small pension from the NHS. Already stated, prior to joining this Parliament, I worked for part-time for 2 years as a driver for the out-of-hours service, doctor service, undertaking 5 shifts per month and overtime as required. During that time, I saw with my own eyes the excellent NHS that Scotland has. And it's outstanding work done by all the staff who work in the NHS. And that's why I don't take kindly to the political football that the Labour Party has rolled out yet again today. Jackson, we last deja vu, Jackson Carlo, deja vu, we last debated this on the 19th of the 9th, 12. If they truly cared for Scotland's NHS, they would have used all their allocated time this afternoon, not just to fit it in along with a police debate. It's their time in the chamber to allocate. They decide what they want to discuss, right? No, I won't, because I've only got 4 minutes. I agree with the Cabinet Secretary. This debate should have had more time. I believe the NHS should remain a universal health service, free at point of need, true to its founding principles. I also believe that the Scottish NHS should remain a publicly funded, publicly delivered service. We should continue to protect frontline services, ensuring NHS staff have stability and security in their employment. Only by bringing powers home to Scotland can we protect our NHS from Westminster cuts and build a better nation. Staffing levels are higher than they were prior to SNP taking office, contrary to Labour's suggestion, and she constantly wheels it out in her sorry, I do apologise. Jackie Bailey, I do apologise. Jackie Bailey, constantly, the Tory party said when they were talking about the First Minister last week, right? So I apologise to Jackie Bailey. Knows that there have been changes. The Labour Party knows there have been changes in dramatic change in nursing practices over the last 10 years. We now have care in the community. This has meant a fundamental change in nursing practice. Social work and NHS visit clients in their own homes, and not for the 15 minutes that Jackie Bailey suggests. Labour need to substantiate their assertion by continually repeating it. They're given the impression this is common practice, undermining the hard work and the dedication of care workers in Scotland. The UK Home Care Association found in a survey, you don't like it when you're getting told the truth, though there were fewer responses from Scottish providers than in other parts of the UK, that 58% of visits in Scotland were over half an hour. Half an hour. This government has defended the NHS in Scotland against the cuts implemented by the Tory Liberal government and caused by the Labour Party. I remember the letter left by the Labour Minister. There's no money left. And as I've already said, the Labour Party needs to stop using our health service as a political football. Stop talking our NHS down. Time to talk it up. Time to appreciate our staff. We have a health service to be proud of, and we should admit it. The previous Health Secretary should be complimented in looking after the NHS in her term. And I am sure the new Health Secretary, Cabinet Secretary, will also look after the Scottish Health Service, and I support the Government on what it's doing to safeguard our NHS. To finish, I'm lucky. I only visit my doctor once every 10 years. He often says to me, "Who are you?" Right? Other countries charge for a visit to their doctors. We don't. The Scottish NHS deserves our thanks, not continual kicking.
Thank you. We now turn to the winding up speeches. Now call on Jackson Carlo, 4 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I honestly really just want to stand here and scream. Had I still been in business and a management meeting had received the level of contribution in response to an emerging crisis that we've heard this afternoon, I'm afraid the management team would have had to go and be replaced. So let me start off by saying I welcome all the good things that are happening in the NHS. It's wonderful news. I'll pat every SNP minister on the back if they are responsible for them. But I will say it's wonderful about dentistry. It's great that there's a focus on alcohol, and none of that is a substitute for us debating responsibly and reasonably the emerging difficulties that there are within the National Health Service. And when SNP members, the repeated refrain this afternoon was, "I've only got 4 minutes." Frankly, anything they could have said could have usefully been said in 2, and we could then perhaps have had room for an examination of the questions that they were refusing to answer. Let me come back to what I said earlier to Alec Neil. His predecessor's style was to be the spider at the centre of the web, weaving, carefully controlling the figures, crisis managing, maybe stinging with venom anybody who had anything negative to say in relation to the conduct of the health service. The smell of fresh paint that accompanied it, I think, on every hospital visit. The sense that this was a projection as much of the Deputy First Minister as an entity as the health service and its problems that needed to be addressed. That's not Mr Neil's style. He's the bull in the china shop. And that's maybe what the health service needs. I actually think in the Cabinet Secretary there is a man who can make the most of the opportunity presented. And that's why I've welcomed some of the initiatives that he's taken. They are practical steps which are directly contradictory to the positions his predecessor was insisting vehemently until the day she demitted office. So let me say, I'd like him to go back and look again at health visiting. The RCN have made a very well-balanced and sensible proposal to the Children's and Young Persons Bill. They believe that health visiting is central to the preventative agenda, which will in turn help to reduce many of the obstacles we see to being able to provide an effective health service in the future. I'd like him to dust down that report on Stracathro, which his predecessor consigned to the bin. There, the independent sector, acting exclusively for the NHS at a saving of £2 million, produced a service which significantly reduced NHS waiting times. That £2 million, if extrapolated and utilised anywhere else, would alleviate the financial pressures the Cabinet Secretary is facing. I'd like him to look at the prospect of walk-in centres that might relieve the pressure on GPs. I'd like him... Was it 4 or 3?
4 minutes.
Oh, right, sorry. I'd like him to look at the responsibility agenda that we've sometimes talked about getting the public to recognise that if we are to have a future health service free at the point of delivery when most needed, then we have to have people understand they need to use the NHS responsibly. And above all, I welcome what he has said about access to new medicines, but 21,000 people have benefited from the Cancer Drugs Fund in England. That's 2,100 Scots who have not. It is too little, too late to stand and preach and pray. We need to see practical actions from a practical man addressing the problems the health service has today. And as a chamber, we need together to accept that, yes, there's a football that will be kicked, but there is an emerging problem facing Scotland's health service which will only be properly addressed if it's addressed beyond this debate and all the rhetoric together.
Thank you. I now call on Alex Neil, Cabinet Secretary, 6 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. Can I first of all say to Jackson Carlow, I'm happy to look at the issue around health visiting and indeed issues and initiatives around the likes of the family nurse partnership. And the relationship between that kind of service and the health visitor service is absolutely important. Can I also say to Jackson Carlow that as a result of his inspiration and the point you raised in the previous debate, I paid a back-to-the-floor visit to the Victoria Hospital the other night. I spoke to staff, nobody of a higher grade than staff nurse, deliberately. I spoke to auxiliaries from the Accident and Emergency Department. I spoke to people from the medical and surgery departments as well. And in all the visits I've seen, there is one thing I'm absolutely clear about, and that is that we need to empower much more the people on the front line to take key decisions, and I think that will be one of the ways in which we can improve the quality of delivery of the health service on the ground.
My other two visits were to the Accident and Emergency Unit at Edinburgh Royal Infirmary and the Accident and Emergency Unit at Glasgow Royal Infirmary. And I have to say, Presiding Officer, I would recommend such visits to other members. I learn more in 1.5 hours talking to frontline staff than 6 months of written briefing, or indeed 6 months of reading Jackie Bailey's speeches could ever tell me at all. Can I say, Duncan McNeill is right. There are three really big challenges facing the National Health Service in the future. The first one is the ageing of the population, and that has an associated challenge, which is the multiple morbidities now of people of older age. Secondly, there are two financial challenges. One is, obviously, the cuts that have emanated particularly on the capital budget, but also inflation in the health service is twice the level of inflation generally. And the third big challenge, and by no means the least, is the inequalities in healthcare and indeed the consequences of inequality and poverty generally, Presiding Officer, and its impact on the demands of the National Health Service. And I have to say to Jackson Carlaw in particular that the impact of the benefit reforms being implemented from London, I think, unfortunately, will add to that pressure arising from increased poverty and deprivation. And I hope they will think again about some of these proposals. Can I just also, in terms of some of the points raised in the debate, say to Sarah Boyack, it's a fair point about the 85% occupancy rate. The report by Dr Foster that she referred to was dealing with the health service in England, but just for the record, let me tell that bed occupancy capacity rates, the use of beds in Scotland in 2006-07 was 82.3%, well below the 85% trigger point. And in 11-12, the latest year for which figures are available, the bed occupancy rate was 82.2%. So basically very similar, and within the safety level of the 85% that was recommended in that report. I would accept the 85% figure as an indication of the right level of the utilisation of bed capacity to maintain patient safety. So just for the record, we're well within the 85%.
Like Alec Neil, I made a visit to the accident emergency this year, but it was as a result of an accident rather than an official visit. And one of the key things that they said to me was that they do have a major problem of getting access to beds for people both coming in through accident and emergency. And I think that's at the root of the issue about the Royal Victoria. So I do think it's something that would be good if the Minister could keep his eye on, because that issue of not having alternative places for people to go is partly what is creating major problems in terms of the pressure in the Edinburgh Royal. Cabinet Secretary.
Can I say the real root of the problem in the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary is that the plans for the hospital grossly underestimated the number of beds required by a factor of 20%. And I'm not making a party political point, but it wasn't this administration who was responsible for that particular problem. And the reason why we have to use the Royal Victoria in Edinburgh is because the Royal Infirmary in Edinburgh should have been bigger by a factor of at least 20%. Can I also, by the way, say to Sarah Boyack that in terms of the reports, financial reports from the health boards, I can confirm that NHS Lothian have confirmed that they're forecasting to break even this year, and indeed all boards are indicating they're on track to deliver their financial targets in 2012-13. Can I also, just for the record, Presiding Officer, in terms of the increase to the territorial boards that I said, it is 2.9%, 3.3% and 3.1% respectively for the 3 financial years from 2012 to 2015.
Last minute.
Can I say, Presiding Officer, I think we've got to get the text of this debate correct. The vast bulk of what is happening in the National Health Service, the Patient Safety Programme, the Quality Programme, the Family Nurse Partnership, to pick just 3 examples, are actually leading edge internationally and recognised as such. Indeed, the Commonwealth Fund of America did a survey in terms of patient safety recently, an international study which showed that 3% of patients in Scotland felt safe in hospital compared to 9% in the rest of the UK. So by any comparison, there's a great deal going right in the National Health Service. Of course, as Jackson Carlaw and others have said, we have to also recognise in this very big organisation
there are some things we've got wrong. Where we have got it wrong, we'll sort it. And where there are cases, if there are individual cases, like Jackie Bailey referred to in her speech, write to me about them, I will investigate them, and will come back with an answer.
You must conclude, Cabinet.
So basically, Presiding Officer, the National Health Service is something we should be proud of. That's not about complacency, it's about making sure we do not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Thank you. And I call on Dr Richard Simpson to wind up. 8 minutes, Dr Simpson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think the debate took a different tone in the last 10 minutes. I think that the Cabinet Secretary has actually dealt with the debate in a much more measured tone than the stereotypes of his backbenchers, who simply parrot fashion come out with a series of statements, half of which are actually rubbish.
All of them.
Can I say, though, that the one thing I do agree with them on, and clearly all speakers in the Chamber agree on, is that we continue to owe a huge debt of gratitude to our staff in the NHS. And as Christmas is approaching, and unless the Government breaks its habit of this Parliament and finally tables a debate on health, this will be the last debate on health. So we do owe them a huge debt, and without their efforts, we would really be in even more trouble. The NHS is continuing to perform well, but there are treacherous waters ahead. There are huge risks, especially in ensuring that the quality of care does not suffer with further financial squeeze. Not my words, Anne Dixon from the King's Fund. The NHS is on an amber warning, not my words, or the Auditor General's words. 9 boards with underlying deficit, £1 billion in backlog in repairs. Now, the previous Cabinet Secretary, despite the caricature of Jackson Carlo, actually did do some things right, but she did also choose repeatedly to ignore the warnings that we gave her, dismissing them, as one of the speakers in the SNP said today, as scaremongering, which is what we're always accused of. So, she continued to deliver Scotland's patient safety programme, which is a world-leading programme, started by Labour and continued by the SNP. And it has delivered significant reductions in adverse effects, and as the Cabinet Secretary just said, a feeling of safety greater than most health services. But at the same time, she failed to change a culture which is blaming, which is bullying, as shown by the reports from the NSS staff report, where 60% of staff reported being bullied. She failed to introduce a whistleblowers line for almost 2 years of my campaigning on this, and I compliment the Cabinet Secretary that he's finally done so. That is very welcome. Let's look at delayed discharges. We started a programme in 2001 when there were 3,000 delayed discharges, and a programme that was meant to reach zero in 2008, which it did. Brilliant. The Health Service, SNP and Labour achieved their target. But they then promised, the government, SNP government then promised that they would actually keep that at zero. But at 14 out of the last 17 quarters, since then, that promise has been broken. The numbers have risen. And today there are 91 patients over 6 weeks in the most recent survey, almost 1,000 beds still occupied by patients deemed fit for discharge. There are 1,000 beds, 600 delayed discharges, 283 complex needs. So there are 800 beds occupied by people who do not medically need to be there. Now, what about beds? I've been repeatedly attacked on this issue, but it is a fact that the SNP manifesto in 2007 promised not to reduce them. The beds were then reduced by 1,800. I've said that's not necessarily a bad thing if you've got good redesign, but it is something on which the SNP made false promises. Let's look at dementia, because no one's mentioned that as a huge challenge that we're facing. The previous Cabinet Secretary, under pressure, finally introduced the Health Improvement Scotland inspections. And finally, again, after months of my asking, under the current Cabinet Secretary, I'm very glad, and again I commend him, for the fact that he has produced a thematic report on these inspections. But this thematic report says that cognitive assessments are very patchy, there are concerns about nutrition, and boarding out, which the previous Cabinet Secretary, and again welcome, introduced, but was never followed through on because we don't actually get reports of what's happening. Except when we did an FOI, we found that there were patients who were moved up to 18 times within a hospital. And currently the Royal Colleges have reported that tonight there will be 1,600 patients who they regard as likely to be receiving suboptimal care, not medical treatment, suboptimal care, because of the pressures the system are under. The previous Cabinet Secretary left a slow erosion of care, an increasing level of frustration and glowing anger that is getting greater by the day, and certainly my postbag is full of. Now, despite the absolutely ridiculous debate that there is about workforce in 2007 and who had more and who had less, it is a fact that we've got rid of 2,300 nursing posts. And is anyone really saying that can be done without putting pressure on those who remain? And we've got vacancies in doctors' posts in Lanarkshire. We've got paediatric services in Lothian, which were said to be nothing to do with money and resources by the previous Cabinet Secretary in July, another piece of denial, and yet within the last 2 weeks we learned that they're in crisis. We've had an 8% cut in medical students intake into Scotland, but an increase in English students. We've had 3 midwifery schools closed quite peremptorily by the previous Cabinet Secretary. No discussion with the schools involved. No discussion with the United Kingdom, where there is an overall shortage of midwives. Oh, no. And we've had a 20% cut in the nursing student intake. No risk assessment of the effect upon these university departments. Let's turn to access to medicines. We raised that issue in the last Parliament, and the previous Cabinet Secretary responded. Great. Welcome. Commendable. Introduced a new system called IPTR. But within months of that taking place, it was realised this system wasn't working. The doctors are telling us repeatedly it's not worth even applying because the system just does not work. And we've got doctors in the this week actually standing up, oncologists, and complaining bitterly that Scotland is a second-rate service in terms of oncology, can't attract staff. Commend the Cabinet Secretary for introducing the Rutledge-Scott report. Excellent, good response. What about waiting times? Well, that's been dealt with by a number of speakers. We raised the issue of the Lothian waiting times. I raised that. What I didn't know at the time was that there was already an internal report within Lothian on the basis of a request by Naomi Hamilton had already been done. We've never seen the light of day of that report, which occurred well before I raised the issue. And is it complete? Has the Lothian issue been put to bed? Well, I can tell you. Many case studies, I'll just take one. Patient sole carer for a 92-year-old mother, complex care package for her mother, needs someone with her all the time. She asks at her first outpatient appointment that if the appointment could be delayed till mid-December, after which her brother is returning from France to help with her mother's care. What happens? She gets 2 phone calls from a private hospital in Glasgow offering her 2 appointments for 8 a.m. in the morning when she cannot possibly attend and totally contravenes her stated wishes at her first appointment. Sorry, you've had your 2 appointments, you're off the list, go back to your GP and re-referred. The GP is livid. And she has quoted me 4 other cases of the same thing occurring in Lothian. And we've waiting time problems in Grampian, in Glasgow, where there's still blankets problems. I've got an email here. But take your blankets to your scans and x-rays, because you may not have one when you get back. Cabinet Secretary, we're not saying the health service is bad. We're not saying that you're not doing your best. But what we are saying is, unless we all face up to the fact that, as 2 senior members said to me within the last week, we are facing implosion in the health service within the next 2 years. Unless we're all honest about that, then we are not going to get through the current austerity. It is time, Cabinet Secretary, for you as the new man to adopt reality.
That concludes the debate on Scotland's health service. We now move on to the next item of business, which is a debate on the Referendum Scotland Bill Committee, the first report 2012, the Scotland Act 1998, modification of Schedule 5, Order 2013. Members who wish to take part in the debate should press the Request to Speak button now. And I call on Bruce Crawford to open the debate on behalf of the Referendum Scotland Bill Committee. Mr Crawford, you've got 8 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I begin my contribution to this short but nevertheless very important debate by stating that I believe all of the committee members recognise the importance of the role we've been asked to undertake by the Parliament. Over the coming months, we will have the privilege of scrutinising the legislation that will be submitted to us by the Scottish Government. Legislation, and here I feel the weight of history bearing down on me, that will enable the people of Scotland to make their most important decision in over 300 years. In the autumn of 2014, the people of Scotland will make their choice, and I know that members of the committee are seized with an understanding of the importance of the role we have been asked to discharge. Indeed, I think it is safe to state that the committee members feel honoured to have been asked to serve the people of Scotland in this way. I also know too that we will all want to play our full part in ensuring that the legislation that is brought before Parliament is fit for purpose, and that it commands not only the confidence of Parliament, the confidence of both governments, but most importantly the confidence of the people of Scotland. It is therefore vital that the bills are subjected to the most detailed and comprehensive scrutiny, and I know that committee members are looking forward to undertaking their responsibilities. We are already considering whether to have an advisor to help us in our work, and next week we will begin the task of examining what evidence and information sessions we need to undertake in the new year to help us get to grips with the potential complexities of the legislation. However, that is for the future. The committee's first task was to consider the Scotland Act 1998, the modification of Schedule 5, Order 2013 in brackets draft, also known as the Draft Section 30 Order, which provides the legal framework for both the Referendum at Scotland Bill and the Paving Bill on aspects of voter registration. The draft order was, of course, announced as part of the historic Edinburgh Agreement, which was signed on the 15th of October 2012, and the order was laid before both the UK and Scottish Parliaments on the 22nd of October. The Edinburgh Agreement, of course, commits both the Scottish and Westminster governments to, and here I quote, to work together to ensure that a referendum on Scottish independence can take place and that it should have a clear legal base, be legislated for by the Scottish Parliament, be conducted so as to command the confidence of parliaments, governments and people, and deliver a fair test and the decisive expression of the views of the people of Scotland, and the result that everyone will respect. Now, the committee took oral evidence from a number of witnesses, but in particular the Deputy First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, MSP, and the Secretary of State for Scotland, Michael Moore, MP, both of whom I would like to thank on behalf of the committee for the open and straightforward way they dealt with the questions put to them by committee members. I would like to come back to the oral evidence-taking sessions in particular later. The committee also received written evidence from 9 organisations or individuals. And at this stage, I would like to extend a sincere thanks, not a severe thanks, to all provided us with the evidence to help in our deliberations. I would also very much like to thank the clerking team, the parliamentary legal advisers and SPICE, all of whom helped support the committee in its work and in coming to its conclusions. The committee was established on the 23rd of October. Our call for evidence was published on the 26th of October. Oral evidence taken at meetings on the 8th and 15th of November, culminating in the committee's report published on the 23rd of November. That, in terms of timescale we were set to undertake our initial task, looks pretty efficient to me. But much of that is down to the clerks, and I thank them on behalf of the committee for the diligent way they went about their tasks with such short notice to get the show up and running. Indeed, I think it was Tavish Scott, who was the first member at the committee, to thank the clerks for the production of such a well-constructed draft report. That certainly helped all members in unanimously signing up not only to the draft order, but also to the committee report itself. And lastly, can I thank my colleagues on the committee for the constructive way they went about their business. It made my job as the convener of a parliamentary committee for the first time all the easier. I thank the committee for that and for gently reminding me that I was no longer a government minister, but now in a different modus operandi. I will try hard to remind myself of that as we go through the process of scrutinising legislation that the Scottish Government introduces. But back to the evidence the committee took, as well as oral evidence from the Deputy First Minister and the Secretary of State for Scotland. We also took evidence from academics, Professor Aileen McCard, Alan Trench, Dr Nicola McEwen and Navraj Singh Gali. I will touch in very general terms on the evidence. On the significance and effectiveness of the Section 30 order, witnesses agreed that the purpose of the order was to ensure the Parliament has the legislative competence to pass a referendum bill. Deputy First Minister summed up the importance of the order, saying it puts the legality of the referendum beyond effective legal challenge using a perfectly legitimate, tried and tested, robust process. On the conditions imposed by the order, witnesses agreed that the effect of the order is to require a binary choice and that a third or middle option, such as enhanced devolution, would be excluded. The Deputy First Minister told the committee she regretted that there would not be the potential option of a second question, but said it was a concession she was prepared to make as part of negotiating a wider package. On the role of the Electoral Commission, witnesses placed great emphasis on the importance of its role of the Electoral Commission in ensuring the fairness of the referendum process. It was accepted by witnesses that the Electoral Commission was an advisory body rather than a decision-maker, but whose expertise means its views should always be carefully considered. Indeed, the Secretary of State said, "The Commission has great moral authority and established credibility. For that reason, I think it would be extraordinary if serious recommendations made by the Commission were disregarded." On the wider issues, and there were some, written evidence which was flagged up to us from the 9 individuals who submitted information to us that will need to be considered during the scrutiny of the referendum bill itself. But in conclusion, I believe that the scrutiny of the draft order has provided clarity on the legality of the referendum. The committee unanimously welcomed and agreed both the draft order and, indeed, if I've got this right, the wider Edinburgh Agreement itself. I thank all of the committee members for the constructive approach they have taken so far. I sincerely hope this will continue as the committee moves into its main task in the new year, the scrutiny of the 2 government bills, setting out the detail of how the referendum is to be conducted. I think one of the things that the committee were particularly keen on in terms of the evidence we took was the last sentence of the actual agreement, which states the 2 governments are committed to continue to work together constructively in light of the outcome, where it's in the best interest of the people of Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom. I think that set the tone well for the committee in future. And finally, I think it would be appropriate on behalf of the committee to recommend to Parliament that when we reach our decision time this evening, we give our unanimous approval to the Scotland Act 1998 Modification of Schedule 5 Order 2013 in brackets draft. Thank you very much.
I now call on Nicola Sturgeon, Cabinet Secretary. You've got 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I begin by thanking Bruce Crawford and the Referendum Committee for proposing this debate. I very much welcome the committee's report on the draft Section 30 order and, of course, its unanimous cross-party agreement to recommend to this Parliament that the draft order be approved. I'd also like to thank the Presiding Officer for extending the time allocated for this debate to allow members to discuss and explore the issues raised in the committee's report more fully. As we set out in our consultation paper back in January, it is this Government's intention to have a referendum on independence in autumn 2014. And we believe that it should be for this Parliament to make the final decision on how that referendum will be run to ensure that it meets the highest international standards. So I am absolutely delighted that in signing the Edinburgh Agreement with the UK Government, we have succeeded in agreeing a clear process to achieve this, subject to the approval of both the members here today and the Westminster Parliament in due course. The Section 30 order will allow the Scottish Parliament to pass legislation for a referendum that is very definitely made in Scotland, a referendum that will also be beyond effective legal challenge. And I note that the committee's report records that all witnesses agreed that the order before us was fit for purpose in this respect. The agreement, Presiding Officer, leaves it open for this Parliament to decide on the overwhelming majority of the referendum details. It's no secret, and Bruce Crawford alluded to this point, that we would have much preferred this Parliament to decide on whether there should be one question or 2 questions on the referendum ballot paper, but that was the UK Government's red line in the negotiations. Overall, though, I believe the package that is encapsulated in the Section 30 order and in the agreement ensures the primacy of this Parliament in legislating for a referendum. The Scottish Government will set out detailed proposals for how we think the referendum should be run in 2 bills that will be introduced to Parliament in early 2013. The substantive main bill will be the Referendum Scotland Bill, and as members are aware, we will also introduce a paving bill, which I'm very pleased to say will enable all 16 and 17-year-olds to participate by voting in the referendum, a proposal that I hope will
meet with the approval of the Parliament. The proposals taken together, Presiding Officer, will cover the date of the referendum, the franchise for the referendum, the question to be asked, the referendum rules, campaign spending limits. All of that, of course, will be informed by our consultation and by expert advice. The analysis of the 26,000 responses to our consultation showed broad support for our initial proposals on these issues, and these responses will inform the development of our more detailed proposals. In addition, my officials are in regular discussion with electoral professionals and experts, including the Electoral Commission, to ensure that the legislation will provide for a referendum run to the highest standards of transparency, fairness and propriety. The role of the Electoral Commission in testing the question and in overseeing the referendum more generally has been discussed at length, both in the committee's evidence sessions and elsewhere. Let me be very clear about the Electoral Commission. The role that we envisage for the Commission is exactly the same role that it would have if the referendum was being governed by the UK Parliament. As with all referendums held under UK legislation, the role of government is to propose, the role of the Electoral Commission is to advise, and the role of Parliament is to decide, and the Commission share that view. Members will know that I have written to the Commission to ask them to begin testing the intelligibility of the proposed referendum question. The Commission will publish its report in due course, which the Government will consider, and Parliament will have the opportunity to make a final assessment of the question and all the other proposals on the running of the referendum when the referendum bill is introduced. As I said to the committee... Sorry, yes, of course I will.
Christine Graham.
I'm just a little bit surprised, Cabinet Secretary, but are you not surprised, as I am, there's nobody in the front benches of Labour and the Conservatives in this debate?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, I am, and I was...
Excuse me, Cabinet Secretary, Ms McNaugh's got a point of order.
Apologies. I wonder if it would be possible, Presiding Officer, to talk amongst ourselves for 2 or 3 minutes while someone fetches somebody for the front benches of the two opposition parties.
Patricia Ferguson, point of order.
Sir, I would politely point out to my colleagues that I am the spokesperson for Labour on this issue. I don't happen to be sitting in the front row because I was here for the 2 previous debates and was sitting in this position. I didn't think it polite to continue the removal of those from the front bench earlier than was necessary, and I will be speaking from Labour from where I'm sitting.
A point of order, Annabel Goldie.
Presiding Officer, if I may clarify, I am here as my party's representative on the Referendum Bill Committee, an undertaking which I think everyone across the Chamber recognises to be significant and important, as the convener has indicated. I actually thought it appropriate in that role I should sit here.
I don't think there's any need for me to respond to the point of order. I think we've had a fair airing of it. If we could now get back to the debate, because time is extremely tight, I call on Nicola Sturgeon to continue.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It is not for me to comment on decisions taken by the opposition parties, except to say that I do think Margaret MacDonald and Christine Graham, not the Presiding Officer, raise legitimate points. I think anybody looking in would probably wonder why the front benches of the main opposition parties were empty at the moment. But anyway, on to more important matters. I was concluding my point on the Electoral Commission. We will take the Electoral Commission views very seriously, and I hope members will be assured that ultimately it will be for members of this Parliament to make the final decisions on the legislation that will come forward. To conclude, Presiding Officer, because I know time is tight, I am very pleased that as we pass this Section 30 order, if it is indeed passed by this and the UK Parliament, then we will move from process onto the substantive debate about why Scotland should be an independent country. Earlier this week I set out the Scottish Government's vision for Scotland as an independent country. We know why we want to bring powers home to Scotland. We want our country to have a sustainable economy that works for the many, not for the few. We want our country to prioritise the well-being of its citizens over spending on weapons of mass destruction. We want Scotland to be a country with enterprise and social justice as its hallmarks, and we believe passionately that having the powers of independence is essential to achieving that vision of Scotland that we on this side of the Chamber share. So we look forward to bringing forward our arguments. I encourage those who argue for business as usual to do likewise, then we'll have a rigorous debate and the people of Scotland will take the decision. So I urge all members to vote in support of the order in order that we can move forward with this extremely important debate in our country's history.
I now call on Patricia Ferguson. Ms Ferguson, you've got 5 minutes.
And can I, for Scottish Labour, thank sincerely the convener of the Referendum Bill Committee for not once but twice giving the full title to the Section 30 order. As a result, I feel that I have no obligation to do so and will therefore refer it simply, as it's known by us all, as the Section 30 order. So thanks to Mr Crawford for that. But can I also add my thanks to the Referendum Bill Committee's excellent clerking team, who have served the committee well and kept us on track with a very time-critical process. I look forward to working with them and with colleagues over the coming months, when I suspect the challenges may be even greater. I would also like to register my thanks to the witnesses we heard from, some of whom made the effort to assist the committee at very short notice indeed. As we know, the committee's first task was to scrutinise the Section 30 order agreed by the UK and Scottish governments, which provides the legal framework for the referendum bill and for the paving bill concerning voter registration, both of which the committee expects to receive early in 2013. And that the two governments could agree to, and I quote, work together to ensure that a referendum on Scottish independence can take place, and that it should have a clear legal base, be legislated for by the Scottish Parliament, be conducted so as to command the confidence of parliaments, governments and people, and deliver a result that everyone will respect, is to be welcomed, and clearly lays out the way in which both governments expect the process to be taken forward. Now, the main purpose of the draft order is to extend this Parliament's legislative competence to enable it to pass the legislation that will be needed in order that a referendum can be held. And it attaches 3 conditions. One, that the referendum cannot be held on the same day as any other referendum legislated for by the Scottish Parliament. Secondly, that it must be held no later than the 31st of December 2014, and that it must involve a single ballot paper which offers the voter a choice between only 2 responses. The committee listened carefully and with great interest to the views of witnesses as to the legal standing of what has come to be known as the Edinburgh Agreement. And there are important points of law surrounding this issue. But it was perhaps the evidence of the Cabinet Secretary and the Secretary of State, who both indicated that the two governments were committed to the arguments, that is committed to the agreement. Perhaps they're committed to argument on another day, but on this they're committed to agreement, which is to be welcomed. And that is perhaps the most important point. As the committee's report makes clear, witnesses gave emphasis to the importance of the role that the Electoral Commission would play in ensuring the fairness of the process and in consideration of the question. And as Alan Tench stated, and I quote, "If we got to the point where the Parliament did not follow the advice, that would raise serious problems for the referendum's conduct and respect for the outcome." The committee also noted that Article 4 of the order replicated a power to allow campaign broadcasts by designated campaign organisations in respect of the referendum, and that was considered an important provision with which I would very much agree. It is also perhaps worth noting for future discussion that in written evidence the Scottish Council of Jewish Communities pointed out that holding the referendum on a Saturday would disadvantage Jewish voters and those of other faiths for whom Saturday is the day of rest. And I hope that when we get to the stage of considering the date on which the referendum is held, we take very seriously those views. Similarly, the Scottish Council on Deafness reminded Parliament that the needs of deaf and of hard of hearing voters will have to be considered when material and literature is being produced. I'm sure too that there will be other matters we will wish to take into consideration at that time. But, Presiding Officer, in conclusion, on behalf of Scottish Labour, I welcome this order as an important mechanism to provide a clear legal route for the referendum that is to come.
I now call Annabel Goldie. Ms Goldie, you've got 4 minutes.
Presiding Officer, As the Conservative member of the Referendum Bill Committee, it is a pleasure to take part in this debate, as it was a pleasure with colleagues on the committee under Bruce Crawford's capable convenership to tackle the first part of our work, scrutiny of the Draft Scotland Act 1998 modification of Schedule 5, Order 2013. Not for the first time, Presiding Officer, a title which looked slightly dry in the abstract turned out in practice to actually be extremely interesting. And the role of this Parliament's committee, as the convener has said, is important because although this is a United Kingdom statutory instrument, it can only proceed to law if approved by resolution of both houses of the UK Parliament and of this Parliament. So already, Presiding Officer, enough material here to provide a paradise for constitutional lawyers and other gurus and aficionados of parliamentary process. And I share the convener's admiration for and appreciation of the experts in these fields who provided such useful evidence to the committee. In their absence, I have to say, to use a seasonal metaphor, I think we would have been like shepherds without a star, although sometimes I felt I was looking at a number of stars and slightly dazzled by them all. But that evidence was extremely helpful and provided useful pointers to the committee, not just for the essentially very technical process of scrutinising the draft order, but giving a backdrop to the broader process of the referendum bill itself and the paving legislation for the proposed extension of franchise, both of which are to follow. But let me deal with the simple technical issue of the draft order. Of course, procedurally, that order can only be approved or rejected, so a relatively straightforward choice lay before the committee. And given the prelude of the Edinburgh Agreement between the UK and Scottish governments, approval by the committee was arguably predictable. The only factor which might have precluded such an outcome would have been explicit evidence that the order was incompetent or, as drafted, materially flawed. No such evidence was provided, and the committee unanimously approved it, and Parliament this evening is invited to do the same. What I would like to cover, Presiding Officer, are the broader issues which the scrutiny process flagged up. The first is the status of the Edinburgh Agreement. Paragraph 22 of the report notes that there was broad consensus among oral witnesses about the significance of the agreement. The Secretary of State described it as historic, and the Deputy First Minister described it as a watershed moment in Scotland's Home Rule journey. And whatever the different political destinations desired by the two governments, I am clear that both have confidence in that agreement, have respect for the agreement, and wish the ensuing process to be in the spirit of the agreement, because that is vital to ensure a public confidence in the whole process. Indeed, as paragraph 23 of the report makes clear, that was underpinned by the Secretary of State and the Deputy First Minister, and I welcome Nicola Sturgeon's clarity when she said the Scottish Government was honour-bound politically and morally by the Edinburgh Agreement, which makes it clear that, where appropriate, the rules and certainly the spirit of purpura will govern the referendum. And I do think it important, Presiding Officer, that the spirit of the agreement and what it sets out to do are mirrored by the subsequent actings of politicians. And so it is worth repeating the criteria set down by the agreement in relation to the referendum. It should have a clear legal base, be legislated for by the Scottish Parliament, be conducted so as to command the confidence of parliaments, governments and people, and deliver a fair test and a decisive expression of the views of the people in Scotland, and a result that everyone will respect. I welcome the convener's observations in relation to the Electoral Commission. Presiding Officer, the politics and debate around the referendum will be furious and passionate. In deference to the people of Scotland, let's ensure the process is pure and above reproach.
Thank you, Ms Goldie. We now move to open debate. Can I point out that speeches are a maximum of 4 minutes? Can you please keep it very, very tight, because I'm trying to get everybody who wishes to speak in the debate to have at least some time. I now call on Linda Fabiani to be followed by Richard Baker.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. It's an absolute honour to speak in this debate for someone who believes in independence of our country, to speak in this debate that I believe is a step in the way. As I was serving in that committee, that was such a huge honour as well. The first task, of course, I'm with Patricia Ferguson in this, the draft Section 30 order is what we all understand it as. Of course, as a result of the Edinburgh Agreement, which was agreed on the 15th of October 2012. And that agreement committed the two governments to work together to ensure that a referendum on Scottish independence can take place.
And also as part of that, the memorandum committed the two governments to continue to work together constructively in the light of the outcome of the referendum, whatever that is, in the best interest of the people of Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom. And for me, that was a major shift, because when we think of all the nonsense that was spouted and talked about not all that long ago when we put forward that we wished to have this referendum, I think that sense of mutual respect that came from the Edinburgh Agreement was so worthwhile. And it was very apparent, both from our own Deputy First Minister and Westminster's Secretary of State for Scotland, when they came to the committee, that they had a mutual respect and do intend to work forward in that way. Yes, of course.
Presiding Officer, I wonder what Linda Fabiani might say about the discordant note from the House of Lords report about which is invited to approve a draft Section 30 order with few guarantees that the PPERA scheme governing the fairness of referendum campaigns will be made to apply in Scotland.
Linda Fabiani.
Yes, certainly. I remember Presiding Officer Rob Gibson raising that at committee, and Stuart Maxwell following up on that too. And my view on that is very, very clear. This should be decided by a democratically elected parliament. It's absolutely got nothing to do, as far as I'm concerned, with a bunch of unelected lords and ladies. So, very clear. So yes, our referendum is going to be made in Scotland, with this parliament making the final decision on how it will be run, and to ensure, in the words of the Deputy First Minister, that it meets the highest international standards. And the Deputy First Minister was very clear in her evidence about the respect that would be given to the Electoral Commission, about the respect that the Scottish Government gives to this Parliament, and the respective roles of all these different players in this. As she said in her own speech, any government anywhere in the UK would not depart from Electoral Commission advice unless there was a very strong reason for doing so, and any government that did so would have to justify itself before the Parliament. But there are proper roles of government and Parliament in the process, and we have to respect that process. I think that's the way we can move forward. If we decide to, if everyone decides to carry on this road of respect. There are those who have tried to suggest over the piece that this particular government is cavalier in its attitude to such things. This is far too important for anyone who believes in independence, individual
Member needs to bring her remarks to a close.
Any group. So I'm looking forward to moving forward to the other elements for that committee, votes for 16 and 17-year-olds, the referendum bill itself. I believe, Presiding Officer, we're on a journey to independence with all the potential that brings, and I commend this step on the way.
I now call Richard Baker to be followed by Willie Rennie.
This is rightly being described as an important moment in the debate on Scotland's constitutional future. The passing of this motion will enable this Parliament to determine the legislative process for the referendum, and we've long made the case that this was the right way to proceed. But, Presiding Officer, in the time ahead of the referendum, I suspect there will be few moments of consensus, but I think it's right to congratulate all parties today who have worked to ensure that we can all approve this motion together this evening. We are better together after all. Both parliaments and both governments have done the right thing in ensuring that the referendum bill on which this Parliament will vote will clearly be a legal process with the right legal authority. And can I congratulate both UK ministers and Scottish Government ministers, not least Mr Crawford himself, on achieving that agreement. To have proceeded without that authority would have jeopardised the whole process. It would have resulted in a potentially chaotic situation on an issue of the utmost importance. So it's very welcome that a consensus has been reached to allow the Parliament here to proceed in this way, because this must be a referendum process in which all sides have confidence as being conducted fairly and properly. Of course, there won't be agreement on every point, and to get to this stage, there's had to be give and take on both sides. We have agreed there should be a single question put, which of course was a matter of huge debate, despite the fact we all apparently supported a single question, and we've agreed a timescale, although we believed the referendum could have been held far sooner. We still await the exact date, and we'll look forward to ministers confirming the date in Parliament soon, although we suspect it has already been announced in the Sunday Sun, but we shall see. Although the terms of this Section 30 order have been agreed, in the evidence presented to the Referendum Bill Committee, other important issues have been raised, and I'd like to highlight the importance of the status of the Electoral Commission in providing oversight of the referendum, which members have touched on. It strikes me, particularly in the unprecedented situation we have here in Parliament, with a majority government, this becomes even more important. And there are crucial issues which still require to be resolved. These include the spending limits for the campaign, which must be reasonable enough to allow the campaigns in the short campaign to engage properly with the electorate in what is likely to be a vote with a much higher turnout than normal elections. And there is still the matter of the final question to be decided, which is an issue of debate because there is not a consensus on the current wording. It's absolutely crucial that the Scottish Government not only seeks advice from the Electoral Commission on these issues, but abides by that advice. Alan Trench, in his evidence to the committee, was right to state that, giving the Electoral Commission a more limited role than that envisaged in the agreement, would carry significant legal and constitutional risks. So I hope ministers will reflect carefully on these issues in the time ahead. But today, hopefully, we can begin to move beyond the debate on process and onto the debate on the substantial issues in the run-up to this crucial referendum, where I am hopeful and confident the result will be not the break-up of the United Kingdom, but a confident Scotland deciding to retain its membership of a strong and successful partnership of nations.
Now call Willie Rennie to be followed by Annabel Ewing.
First of all, I'd like to put on the record my appreciation for the work of John Park. This is the last time I think I'll speak before he departs on Friday. I think he's been an excellent Member of Parliament for Mid-Scotland and Fife, and I'll be sad to see him go personally. I think he's a great loss. I'm here as Tavish Scott's substitute. He's not well today. I was once a substitute when I was a boy playing football at school, but I was never a great success at that, so don't get your hopes up for today. I think the Section 30 order, however, is actually something we should all be proud of, because it delivers something in a very mature manner, something that will deliver a referendum where people, not the courts, will decide about the constitutional future of Scotland. Votes at 16 and 17, which our party supports. We were sceptical about this mechanism of doing it, but we support it and we're pleased that it's moving forward. It also delivers a referendum that will be overseen by the Electoral Commission, and I hope and I'm sure that the Scottish Government will give that organisation the respect that it's due, and also will consider that in this referendum there needs to be losers' consent as well. We all need to be bought into the process. We all need to accept the result in that respect. So treating the Electoral Commission with respect is especially important. That fundamentally what Michael Moore, my colleague, previously said, this is about delivering a legal, fair and decisive referendum, and I think the Section 30 order does that. We were also pleased that the UK Government were able to help the SNP deliver their manifesto promise, because otherwise it would have been difficult to do so. That promise to deliver a single question referendum. So we in the Liberal Democrats are pleased to be able to help our colleagues in the Scottish Parliament deliver a manifesto promise. We also commend, I think, Bruce Crawford for the work that he did in the early stages as a Government Minister and the latter stages as a member of the committee. There were extreme voices on either side of this debate. People like Michael Forsyth in the House of Lords, who believed that it should be all London. Nobody in Scotland, nobody in the SNP should be trusted to do any of this. And then others who said London should have nothing to do with it, and it should all be here and nobody else should have a say. And I think what Bruce and latterly Nicola Sturgeon, but also my colleague Michael Moore, managed to do was to just calmly but very determinedly see their way through the myriad of difficulties in achieving this. But they did achieve it, and I'm pleased that they have done so. There is one thing that I, however, do want to address. I think we are slightly exaggerating paragraph 30 and its significance in this. Of course, the remainder of the United Kingdom, its government and the Scottish Government work constructively. You would expect neighbours to work constructive. That will be the case. But it doesn't necessarily mean that a foreign government, the United Kingdom, the remainder of the United Kingdom, would agree to every single demand of the foreign Scottish government. So we just need to get this into context. Of course, there'll be a respect. Will respect the outcome. Both governments, I'm sure, would do that, because you want to have long-standing relationships, and that is important. But please, let's put this into context. Of course we'll agree, but let's not exaggerate the significance. But I want to commend everybody and the committee and the clerks for the work they've done on this. I think it's been an excellent process, and I hope it can lead to a referendum debate we can all be proud of. Thank you.
I now call Annabel Ewing to be followed by Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I say at the outset what a great privilege it is for me to be a member of the Scottish Parliament's Referendum Scotland Bill Committee. And I would add, Presiding Officer, although it probably won't come as any surprise, that that is indeed a view shared by my mother, Winnie Ewing, who is also very proud that I am sitting on this committee. It is also a great pleasure, Presiding Officer, because I am the newest member of this Parliament having a full seat on the committee, and therefore it's a great pleasure to find myself surrounded by experienced colleagues from all sides of the political divide. And I'm pleased to report that our meetings thus far have been characterised by cogent debate and at the same time, I think, good humour. And all this has been facilitated by the excellent clerks at our disposal and, as has been said by other members, the legal adviser and, of course, Spice. I sincerely hope, Presiding Officer, as we move towards more contentious matters, that the Referendum Scotland Bill Committee will continue to operate in such a constructive and positive manner. Of course, the context of the setting up of this committee must be borne in mind, and that is the mandate obtained by this SNP government to hold a referendum on the independence of our country, further to its landslide majority in the Scottish parliamentary elections last year. And all Democrats must surely accept that the Scottish Parliament, in its current composition, represents the vote of the people of Scotland in a democratic election. And yes, I would say to Richard Baker, that is indeed a majority SNP government. And surely all Democrats must also accept that it is therefore this Scottish Parliament that must legislate on the referendum to ensure that it is indeed a referendum made in Scotland. Certainly.
Duke McMillan.
Thank Annabel Ewing for taking that intervention. Does Annabel Ewing agree with me, therefore, in terms of the vote and going forward, that this Section 30 order and also the Historic Edinburgh Agreement allows for 16 and 17-year-olds to vote for the first time, and also it's actually incumbent upon all of us on both sides of the debate to encourage the 16 and 17-year-olds actually to have their vote heard when it actually does come to the referendum?
Annabel Ewing.
I thank Stuart Millen, a fellow committee member, for his intervention, and he is absolutely correct to say that this is a historic moment for Scotland, also because we will see 16 and 17-year-olds rightly take their part in the democratic process and have the right to vote on the future of their country. The committee, I believe, has produced an excellent report on the draft Section 30 order. As we have heard, it has resulted from the historic Edinburgh Agreement, and it puts beyond any doubt any effective legal challenge, as the Deputy First Minister said, that this Parliament can indeed legislate for the independence referendum. The committee, as has been said, took written and oral evidence in its scrutiny of the draft Section 30 order, and thereafter agreed unanimously to the report and the recommendation that the Section 30 order be approved. And I sincerely believe that that will be seen as a very historic moment indeed in Scotland's journey, Presiding Officer. Contained in the report are portents, perhaps, of future debates to come on the technical detail of the paving bill and, indeed, on the referendum bill itself. I very much look forward to those debates, Presiding Officer, as a lifelong supporter of the independence of my country and as a Democrat to my very fingertips. It will then be, Presiding Officer, for the people of Scotland to decide on their own future. What an attractive prospect that is, Presiding Officer. Thank you.
I now call Patrick Harvey to be followed by Margaret MacDonald. You both have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to thank my fellow committee members, as well as the clerks and other support staff, and our witnesses. I'd also like to thank yourself, Presiding Officer, and the Bureau for ensuring, firstly, that the committee was broad enough, and then enough time was allocated to this debate to ensure that a wide range of voices would be heard in both parts of the process. At a time when agreement didn't seem like it was around the corner, when the UK and Scottish governments were slightly more at loggerheads earlier in the process, it was clear that both needed to give some ground. And I'm glad that the Scottish Government, for example, did compromise on the role of the Electoral Commission, and that the UK Government didn't dig its heels in on the issue of votes at 16. It was necessary for both to give some ground if agreement was going to be reached. I'm glad that agreement was reached in the end, but I want to reflect on one issue. The area where the UK Government did decide, as Nicola Sturgeon said, to lay down a red line, the issue of a single question. Now, I'm personally no great fan of a Devo Max, Indy Light, Devo in-betweeny kind of option. I wouldn't have campaigned for that if it had been on the ballot paper. But the decision of the UK Government to rule out the option of allowing this Parliament to make that decision, of allowing this Parliament to offer that option, effectively closes down, potentially for a generation or more, the option of further devolution. I believe that in this context, if there is a no vote in 2014, UK politicians, the UK electorate, much of the UK media will turn around with a single voice and say, enough with Scotland already. You've had your Parliament, you've had your devolution, you've had your Scotland Bill, you've had your referendum, and I believe that we will have passed up the only once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, the decision of the UK Government to close down this referendum into a single question. I can live with it. But they're the ones who should be worried about it, Presiding Officer. They're the ones who've turned this debate into a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for Scotland to set itself on a new path. I look forward to that debate, Presiding Officer. I look forward to working with my fellow committee members to scrutinise the legislation on votes at 16 and on the referendum. More to the point, I look forward to getting into the campaign.
Thank you, Mr Harvey. We now call Mark MacDonald to be the last speaker in the open debate. Ms MacDonald, you've got 3 minutes.
Thank you. Can I pick up from where my colleague left off? I've found that in speaking to people, when they say to me, I'm not sure about which way I'll vote, I say, well, think what you will feel like on the day after the referendum if you vote no. That usually makes them think about the thing and focus their minds, because what Patrick says is absolutely true. We will have created, from the point of view of people on the other side of the border, all this fuss, and then when we got the chance, bottled it. We will be disparaged and despised in some quarters, and we'll turn in on ourselves. However, 1 or 2 things occurred to me when I was listening to the debate here, and can I thank all the folk who have brought it to this stage. But I wonder if you have considered whether or not the bill can be challenged under European law. Everyone said it couldn't be challenged. I think actually you might find there's wrinkles in the EU law, and so I'd want to know that you were looking at that. I would also want to know what the relationship is between this bill, as it eventually will be, and a constitution. Because, as I recall, the SNP had a party policy for a written constitution. There have been various things promised by way of policy from the party in government. For example, that the monarchy would remain. Who knows if the constitution has got to be determined after independence has been established. Could another option, Devo Max perhaps, be introduced through an amendment? I'm not at all sure. We've said that it couldn't be, but I can't see why it shouldn't be. And I am a bit concerned about campaign spending. Richard Baker's talked about keeping an even field. You can't keep an even field in campaign spending in something like this. Everybody pitches in. As we saw, the American government were willing to. Very briefly, please.
Mr Baker.
In terms of the short campaign, to Margaret MacDonald, we also long campaigns on another issue. The short campaign, that can be determined.
Margaret MacDonald.
In this case, I have to inform the member, size does not matter. Do all campaign teams have access to television, regardless of size? There might only be one in my campaign team. That's why I'm asking. And what happens if opinions do change and we bottle it? How are we going to face up to the second-rate place it will become? Although it's not at this stage in the bill, I think everyone should remember that.
Wind up.
Because the purpose of this is to make every Scot feel better about himself and herself in Scotland.
I now call Annabel Goldie. Ms Goldie, you've got 4 minutes.
Presiding Officer, thank you very much indeed. And I think even although a short debate, this debate has been positive and it's been constructive. And I want to just sort of pick up from where I left off, which was on this question of process. And I have to say I was actually reassured by many of the contributions. And it is the case, and praise where praise is due. Really, Rennie was right. I think the atmosphere had become quite febrile. And I think it is appropriate to pay tribute to Michael Moore, my colleague David Mundell, Bruce Crawford and Nicola Sturgeon for the roles they played in gathering this together and constructing the basis of the edifice of the process, and that basis is, of course, the Edinburgh Agreement. And I think it's interesting that in the course of the debate, a number of contributors have recognised that the integrity of the process is actually vital to all of this. It was encouraging to see a recognition that the passion and the politics, which will be the hallmark of the campaign, and a debate which will be engaged in, I am sure, with fervour and enthusiasm and energy on all sides, regardless of which particular view you support. I think it's important that there has emerged today a recognition that that's one part of the operation, but the other part is ensuring that this process remains one that is unimpeachable, because without that there will not be the necessary degree of confidence by the public. A number of contributors paid or commented on the role of the Electoral Commission, and I thought the report actually was very helpful in this respect, because many witnesses, certainly to the committee, did lay great emphasis on the importance of the role of the Electoral Commission to ensure this fairness, this necessity of reassuring the public that no one set of politicians is trying to hijack the process for a particular end. And, of course, the electoral roll will have an important task in assessing the intelligibility of the question. But I was struck by what one of the witnesses, Alan Trench, pointed out, and I'm quoting here from paragraph 34 of the report. He said that since the Electoral Commission was not mentioned in the Section 30 order itself, it would in principle be possible for this Parliament to pass a bill that gave the Commission a more limited role than envisaged in the agreement. But he warned that such approach could carry significant legal and constitutional risk, and also political risk, because it would jeopardise this perception of fairness that's so important to securing respect for the process. And that view was pretty well agreed by Professor McHard. So it's been helpful, I think, in the course of the debate today to hear acknowledgement by the Deputy First Minister herself, by Linda Fabiani, Richard Baker, Willie Rennie, that we really have a task before us to ensure that we attain these highest standards of fairness and transparency that everybody, regardless of what side of the argument you're on, wishes to see, because I do feel that is absolutely vital to the integrity of the whole process. And I think the only thing I would say in conclusion, Presiding Officer, is that we can understand that passions will run high. We can understand that politics is going to play a very significant and a very momentous role in this whole debate. But I do hope it will be possible to conduct this debate with a degree of mutual respect and courtesy, because I think the people of Scotland deserve that, and we deserve them if we don't acknowledge that obligation on us all.
I now call on Patricia Ferguson to be followed by Nicola Sturgeon. Ms Ferguson, you've got 4 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I firstly thank Willie Rennie for his kind remarks about our colleague and friend John Park, who will be leaving Parliament. Willie Rennie is absolutely right to say that he will be a loss to this Parliament. He'll certainly be a loss to the Labour group in this Parliament, but fortunately not a loss to the wider Labour movement, and we wish him well. Presiding Officer, this has been an interesting, if brief, debate, as was the committee's consideration of the Section 30 order. But I think that it has served to allow there to be a proper discussion of the issues around the Section 30 order and, of course, the memorandum attached to it by the UK and Scottish governments. And this is the first step in the parliamentary scrutiny of the process leading to a referendum to be held less than 2 years from now. And while there has been much discussion at large about what a separate Scotland might look like, there has not yet been an opportunity for Parliament and the people to consider the ideas that the Scottish Government has. I genuinely look forward to the Referendum Bill Committee having the opportunity to consider, scrutinise and report to Parliament on the process, and I hope that Parliament will give full consideration to both the White Paper and the draft legislation which is to follow the Section 30 order. That there are strong opinions for and against independence, we know. We have witnessed those many times in this chamber. But the phase of our discussion that we now begin is different. Both sides of the argument have to realise that the decision the people of Scotland are being asked to make is of the utmost importance. Whatever the result, it is clear that this is the most important decision any of us will be asked to make, and the most important decision Scotland will be asked to make in over 300 years. And in that context, Presiding Officer, I believe that we owe it to the people of Scotland to make the case, yes, passionately, but to make it in a sensible and reasonable fashion. We must be clear and we must be honest about our intentions and our views. We must engage in a debate about our ideas on the economy, society and culture in its broadest sense. Our debates in this place and elsewhere should respect the contrary point of view, because the people of Scotland need to hear the arguments, not have them drowned out by the most strident voice. The constructive working of the UK and the Scottish Governments on the Section 30 order is laudable, as colleagues have said, and shows what can be achieved. And I would like to add my thanks to all of the ministers, both in this place and in Westminster, for their constructive working together to get us to where we are today. Presiding Officer, on Monday, Nicola Sturgeon invited the parties of this Parliament who don't agree with the policy of independence to join with the SNP after a yes vote to work with them to shape the new Scotland. From this side of the chamber, I can say that of course we would work with the SNP in the best interests of the Scottish people if that were to be the result. But as I do not believe that the campaign for independence will succeed, let me say to Nicola Sturgeon that we hope that she will work with us to craft the new Scotland that we want to see emerge when Scotland rejects independence. Presiding Officer, over the next 2 years, we will have disagreements and we will have arguments. We'll have arguments about the kind of Scotland we want to see, and that's absolutely right. But the people of Scotland are relying on us, all of us, to provide them with a clear and coherent choice, to allow them to make an informed choice when they go to vote in 2014. Thank you.
I now call on Nicola Sturgeon, Cabinet Secretary. You've got 4 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start by saying to Patricia Ferguson that I believe in building a new Scotland, but I believe that building a new Scotland needs the new powers of independence to bring that new Scotland about. Can I begin by adding my voice to those who have wished John Park well? In my experience, John Park is someone who was always courteous, thoughtful and perhaps more inclined to build consensus than many are, and I think he will be missed from this chamber, and I, like I'm sure every member, wishes him well. I also thank all members who have contributed to this short but I think very worthwhile debate. In the vein of thanking people, can I thank Bruce Crawford, not just for his contribution to the committee, but for his contribution to this process as a government minister. It's no exaggeration to say that the agreement I was able to conclude would not have been possible without the enormous contribution that Bruce made, and I thank him warmly for that. I would also take the opportunity to pay tribute to Michael Moore, because the spirit in which this agreement was negotiated and concluded was a positive, constructive and respectful spirit, and I believe that that points the way to the way in which our two governments will continue to work together as friends and partners should Scotland become an independent country. I do think it is worth saying that it is in the vested interests of those who oppose independence now to say that everything would be too difficult. I think the reality post the referendum will be very different, because then many of the things that are in Scotland's interest will also be in the interests of the rest of the UK, and we will all work together to make sure that we serve the interests of the people we represent. Of course I will.
In the light of that need for cooperation, Is the Cabinet Secretary aware of the Ireland Act 1949, Section 2, which says, notwithstanding that the Republic of Ireland is not part of His Majesty's dominions, the Republic of Ireland is not a foreign country? Would the Cabinet Secretary wish such a continuing relationship between Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom after independence?
Cabinet Secretary.
Indeed, if when Scotland becomes independent, I will not regard people in England as foreigners, and I don't believe they will regard us as foreigners either. We will be two independent, equal nations working together in the best interests of both our countries, and I think that is a good relationship to aspire to. Presiding Officer, we now have a clear process in place which will lead to a referendum legislated for by this Parliament in the autumn of 2014 that will allow people in Scotland to make their democratic decision. The next stage, of course, is for Parliament to scrutinise the primary legislation. There are a number of issues that will arise there: the franchise, the question, the rules of the referendum, spending limits. The Government will formulate its proposals with care, and I would expect the closest scrutiny of the Committee and Parliament as a whole. And Linda Fabiani is absolutely right. It is not in the interests of anyone who believes in independence, of anyone who has campaigned long and hard for independence, for the referendum to do anything other than meet the highest standards of propriety and command the confidence of all sides. And I believe, I am determined that this referendum will do that. To conclude, Presiding Officer, I really now look forward to the substantive debate and persuading people in Scotland, as Margot MacDonald rightly said, that they really don't want to wake up the day after the referendum to realise that they have opted for business as usual and passed up on that once-in-a-generation chance to win the independence that will allow us to build the country we want to be. That's the chance we've got in 2014. I look forward to persuading the people in Scotland to seize it with both hands.
I now call on James Kelly to wind up for the committee. Mr Kelly, I'd be obliged if you would continue until 5:59.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to conclude the debate on behalf of the Referendum Bill Scotland Committee. Can I start off by thanking Bruce Crawford as committee convener, my fellow committee members, the clerks and all the witnesses who gave evidence during this short but important process. Can I also pay tribute on behalf of the committee to the ministers of both governments on being able to seek an agreement which sought the basis on the process that we've been able to move forward. I think, as Patrick Harvey said earlier in the summer, it was clear that both governments were at loggerheads, and this is a very important process for the people of Scotland. As Bruce Crawford indeed said, this is a significant order that is put before Parliament tonight, and we wanted some clarity around that. Although there were, one of the key issues in this is that of legal competence, and whether the Scottish Parliament would have had the legal competence to go without this order and to run a referendum. I think, although there are different views on that, I think there's agreement across the chamber that, as Willie Rennie said, we don't want a situation where the courts will overrule the people. We want to be able to reach this decision in 2014 and be clear about the result. And this Section 30 order that we hopefully will pass in a few minutes lays the basis for a clear legal framework. Margot MacDonald will give way.
Margot MacDonald.
I thank the member. Did the committee consider whether or not this was compliant with European law?
James Kelly.
I can say to Margot MacDonald that I have looked at the order closely, and the obviously consequential amendment to the Scotland Act. And my view, along with other members of the committee, is that a successful challenge under EU would not succeed. So, I hope she is reassured by that. I think.
Not from a sedentary position, Ms MacDonald. Mr Kelly.
I think it is important that we do have confidence in the process going forward, and it is important that people have signed on to this unanimously, because we have a position where this will set the platform for the referendum going forward, and it gives the Scottish Parliament the legislative competence by amending the Scotland Act in order to run the referendum prior to the end of 2014. In terms of the Electoral Commission, a number of contributors to this debate and also a number of witnesses at the committee referenced the importance of the Electoral Commission, and I think Annabel Goldie was correct to pinpoint the evidence of Alan Trench in saying that the Electoral Commission, although not referenced in the order, were referenced in the agreement. And I think any government, as Nicola Sturgeon herself said, who went against the Electoral Commission would need to have a really good reason for doing so. And the Deputy First Minister did say that she didn't expect to be in a position to be going against the advice of the Electoral Commission. Michael Moore also spoke about the independence and the credibility of that commission, and I think that is very important that we have that confidence going forward. I give way to Gil Patterson.
Is this the same commission that the Unionist parties ignored 7 times, or is it a different one?
James Kelly.
I point out to Mr Patterson that I'm summing up here on behalf of the committee, and I think on behalf of the committee we would all want to see confidence in the Electoral Commission and the Electoral Commission's role respected. No, sorry, I won't take an intervention. I'm drawing to a close. I think this is a very important order. It sets us up for the process going forward. It's clear this is going to be a historic time in Scottish politics. The debate is very important, and I think there's an onus on all parties, on all sides of the debate, to produce a debate of great quality. More people will take part and vote in this referendum than have taken part in elections in Scotland for decades. So let's hope we can get a clear debate going forward, a constructive debate going forward, one that will inspire the people and that will give us a clear choice at the end when the outcome is decided.
Thank you, Mr Kelly. Your timing was perfect. Let's see if I can do as well as Bruce Crawford. That concludes the debate on the referendum Scotland Bill Committee's report on the Scotland Act 1998 modification of Schedule 5 Order 2013 draft. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 5092 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme. I'd ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press the request to speak button now. I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 5092.
Formally moved.
No member has asked to speak against the motion, therefore I will now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 5092 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of 4 Parliamentary Bureau motions. I'd ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 5094 on approval of an SSI in local government elections, motion 5098 in approval of an SSI on the Budget Scotland Act, motion number 5099 on approval of a UK statutory instrument, and motion number 5100 on designation of a lead committee.
Formally moved.
Question on these motions will be put at decision time. There are 9 questions to be put as a result of today's business. I would wish to remind members that in relation to debate on policing in Scotland, if the amendment in the name of Kenny McCaskill is agreed to, the amendment in the name of John Lamont falls. The first question is that amendment number 5087.2 in the name of Kenny McCaskill, which seeks to amend motion number 5087 in the name of Lewis MacDonald on policing in Scotland, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 5087.2 in the name of Kenny McCaskill is as follows. Yes, 63. No, 54. There was one abstention. The amendment is therefore agreed to. And that means that the amendment in the name of John Lamont falls. The next question is that motion number 5087 in the name of Lewis MacDonald as amended on policing in Scotland be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion number 5087 in the name of Lewis MacDonald as amended is as follows. Yes, 63. No, 41. There were 14 abstentions. The motion as amended is therefore agreed to. The next question is amendment number 5088.1 in the name of Alex Neil, which seeks to amend motion 5088 in the name of Jackie Bailey on Scotland's Health Service be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we will move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 5088.1 in the name of Alex Neil is as follows. Yes, 64. No, 41. There were 13 abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 5088 in the name of Jackie Bailey as amended on Scotland's Health Service be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion number 5088 in the name of Jackie Bailey as amended is as follows. Yes, 64. No, 39. There were 15 abstentions. The motion as amended is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 5094 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on approval of an SSI be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 5098 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on approval of an SSI be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 5099 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on approval of a UK statutory instrument be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 5100 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on designation of a lead committee be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We now move on to members' business. Members who are leaving the chamber to go and watch a football game or for any other reason should do so now quietly. I'll allow a short pause to allow members who are not participating in the members' debate to leave and for the public gallery to clear before we move on to members.